Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Best Care Anywhere podcast. I am your host, Anthony, the sleeping giant who has been awakened with a terrible resolve. With me, as always, is my co host, the one eyed monkey hanging from a 10-cent balloon, Ethan Wilson.
I'll be honest with you. It was a 5 cent balloon.
Oh boy.
I had the other nickel and I dropped it and it rolled into a sewer grate and the rats got it. And I I I learned a long time ago that the sewer rats are you leave them be.
Good. We are coming to you on not our regular release day for this podcast. If you are listening to this on the day this episode is released, it is Thursday, December the 7th, 2023, the 82nd anniversary of the Japanese attack on the U.S. naval installation at Pearl Harbor. And to celebrate and remember the occasion, we have decided to do something a little bit different. We are taking a brief departure from the MASH universe to visit the 1970 cinematic masterpiece that is Tora, Tora, Tora. A couple things before we get into the meat of discussing the mostly history. This movie is very much a historical plot. It is very accurate to the events. So we're going to be talking about the movie, but we're going to be talking about mostly the history that is happening on screen and behind the scenes off screen that we don't see. So before we go into any of that, I'm going to make something very, very clear up front. Ethan and I are not historians. I have a very layman civilian interest in World War II. I have not studied any of this in any formal sense beyond my own interests. So please, we are going to be talking very casually. I'm going to be answering questions as I know the answer. If I don't know the answers, I will say so or look them up and, we will have a discussion about it. Please do not take my word as historical fact or do not reference this in a paper, is what I'm saying. We are two dudes talking about nerdy war military history shit. If I get it wrong, I will catch it in the edit and address it. But please acknowledge that we're just two dudes having a talk about a really good movie we watched and its historical context. On that note, there's not a whole lot of prep or back, discussion we have to have about this. So, Ethan, are you ready to just start talking about Tora, Tora, Tora? Do you have profound life information to share with us?
No, I'm ready. I think all the profound information is found in the 2.5 hour runtime of this incredible movie.
So, Ethan and I watched this movie last night, and I know this will be kind of a hard question to answer now that you've seen the movie, Ethan, but before we get into the film and the historical events and all that, what, as a young person growing up in America, 80 years after the events, or 60 to 80 years after the events of this movie, depending on where you want to count your childhood, what is your understanding of America's involvement in the Second World War in general, and then what is your understanding specifically about Pearl Harbor? I know that's like a huge question, but like, what was your understanding growing up about that era of history?
I suppose pre Tora. Specifically, my understanding of it was we were trying to stay out of it. We were trying to, just do our own thing, hang out, and then Pearl Harbor happened and forced our hand, which is something Japan kind of did on their own against Germany's wishes. But because they were allied, it got us not only into the Pacific theater, but into Europe as well. So that was my very layman, very basic understanding of it. And, of course, then the U.S. went into it and kicked ass because we're the greatest fucking country on God's green earth. USA! U.S. Yeah.
Very, very interesting stance to take on the day Henry Kissinger died. Anyway, no, that I would say, Ethan, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, I'd say that is a very accurate description of like most of our generation's understanding of the lead up to the Second World War.
Yeah.
Germany was doing bad stuff. Japan was doing bad stuff. America didn't want to have anything to do with it. It's very much that Family Guy clip where it's like all the kids in the elementary school. Germany's like taking everyone's crap, and America's like, it's not my problem. And then Japan throws a book at him, and it's like, now it's my problem. Like that, I feel like is our generation understanding of how the Second World War went. Which,
well, and so to be fair, I think that if I remember correctly, Japan, you know, we were kind of in a trade war with them. I think we had, and please correct me.
honey.
Did we like
honey.
impose a bunch of sanctions on oil, on sending oil towards them, or what am I thinking of here?
You are touching on, again, I don't mean this derogatory. You are referencing facts that I think most people know. We embargoed oil. There was trade disputes. There was disagreement. There is so much deep nuance and tiny individual decisions that were made over the course of about 100 years that you could argue led to Pearl Harbor happening. And I was saying it, I said it multiple times last night during the film when they would like have these scenes showing you how things evolved, where I'm like, do you understand why I find Pearl Harbor and the lead up to Pearl Harbor so fascinating? Because it's all these little decisions, most of which aren't even really talked about in the movie because there's just not enough time to discuss all of them. But in an essence, you are right. So I guess without further ado, let's start talking about the history, because if we don't, we're going to be here forever. So first of all, Tora is a 1970 film directed by Richard Fleischer. Kinji, another thing. I'm going to say a lot of Japanese names in this episode. I would like to preemptively apologize to the Japanese people if I butcher your names. I'm also going to point this out. And it kind of goes with what I said previously. And Ethan has heard me have discussions like this about World War II before, so I think he'll understand what I'm saying. I am fascinated by this period in history and all its aspects.
Yeah.
There are going to be times in this episode where I seem to be speaking favorably of the Japanese Imperial Army, Navy, and political structure. I do not agree with many of the actions of the Japanese government and its armed forces between the early 1930s to late 1940s. I, however, have a fascination with all the little bits and pieces and moving parts in that era, and I am impressed and intrigued by why some of the decisions were made by not only the Allied powers, but the Axis powers. So if I sound like I'm being pro-Axis governments, no, not what's happening. I am merely trying to provide the context for why they made some of these decisions and why they were forced into some of these decisions by either external forces or their own decisions that they made. So please, I am not the Japanese Empire will rise again guy. No. I am merely trying to give all information to how and why this major historical event happened. So, now that that's out of the way.
Yeah, probably a very good disclaimer to throw down.
Yes.
And I don't even know what we're going to discuss. I just,
Tora, 1970 production by director Richard Fleischer, Kenji Fukasaku, Toshio Masuda. Writers were Larry Forrester, Hideo Oguni. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to edit this so heavily. Hideo Oguni and Ryuzo Kikushima. It has a unbelievably star-studded cast that I'm going to be honest with you, audience. I cannot cover all of them. There are so many incredible actors in this movie. And again, I should put all these disclaimers in one spot, but as I think of them, I'm going to say them. This, like I said, this is not a full historical deep dive into the entire history of the Japanese and American Pacific conquests and confrontations and disagreements and trade agreements. This is merely a casual conversation. If you are interested in any of this from a filmmaking standpoint, a historical standpoint, I'm going to leave all the references I used to prepare for this episode, because there are some amazing YouTube series, podcasts, books, all sorts of cool stuff. So if any of this even remotely interests you by the end of the episode, please seek those out, because they will give you so much more nuance and detail than I can possibly cover in this short, hopefully, episode. Ethan,
Yo.
on that note, what do you notice about when I read out the writers and directors? What stood out to you? Did anything stand out to you?
Well, it's I kind of wanted to talk to you a bit about this because I was just blown away by the sets as a whole, and I'm gonna harp on that quite a bit, unfortunately for our audience. But a lot of Japanese writers and directors, which I suppose makes sense. But you said something that really stood out to me yesterday when we watched the movie, which was at the time, 1970. That was 30 years after the fact, which you equated to. Do you remember what you equated it to for our audience?
I do not.
You said, sort of like making a movie about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Yes. The fact that this film was made only 28 years within my lifetime of the attack on Pearl Harbor is impressive. But again, a lot of the World War II movies were being made through the 50s and 60s.
Well, yeah, of course, but I mean, that one that shows, and from what I understand, at a startling degree of historical accuracy, just the movements of the enemy nation is
Mm-hmm.
impressive. I'd really love to know how they managed to get Japan on board for that, or at least these Japanese writers and directors.
So, and this is a whole nother podcast. I'm sure people have done ridiculous podcasts on both like Japanese culture and history and Japanese filmmaking. From my understanding, and again, I am not an expert on a subject. This is my own observations from some of the films I've seen. You have Japanese war movies set in World War II that show the events historically, but from a Japanese perspective. When the Japanese win, it is not. I don't know how to word. I don't want to make it sound like the Japanese are proud of what they did in World War II, but there is this sense of when you watch a Japanese World War II movie, which there are, and some of them are really well done, there is no sense that they're doing this. It's not a celebration of what happened, but it's not a condemnation of what happened. It's more of a, we're honoring these young men who were fighting for what they believed in, which was the emperor and their nation, and we want to show that true to what they were experiencing, which is it's go watch some the Yamamoto movie is a good one. There's other ones that take place during the Russo-Japanese War and Sino-Japanese War, which again, there's a whole bunch of red and yellow flags when you talk about those conflicts that we're not going to cover in this podcast because it's not pertinent to what's going on in the movie. But go watch some foreign war films. Japan, specifically Russia, when they were making some of the Great Patriotic War, which is what they call the Second World War, some of their war movies are crazy, impressive. For reasons that are obvious if you study the history, not a lot of German viewpoint World War II films made by Germany. There are a couple. There's a really good one, and I can't remember the name of it. It's essentially called the German Band of Brothers. It is about a German Wehrmacht unit on the Western Front. It is a really well done miniseries, but it is very controversial because it's Germany in the 1940s and 30s. You know, it is what it is. The only other one I can think of that I've actually watched recently and will be on our favorite media of 2023 episode when we get to that is I finally watched the entire movie Downfall. The one where you get the memes of Hitler screaming at the desk in the bunker.
Yep.
Wonderful film.
Isn't
Really
that film
depressing, but
like
it's wonderful.
Isn't it constantly criticized because it actually made people sympathetic for Hitler at the end of the war?
I'm gonna talk. Don't get me started because I already want to talk about this movie. The actor whose name escapes me right at this moment, who played Adolf Hitler, absolutely deserved an Oscar for the role, and I know that's a weird thing to say. He did an amazing job, and there are times where you're like, damn, that's Hitler, but damn, he is watching everything he believed in crumble around him. Not a good person, none of what he believed in good, but there is a weird moment that I had in the film where I'm like, damn, why did I for a half second kind of feel bad for this old man who's clearly mentally unwell, who's clearly sick, who's clearly in distress? And then I went, it's Hitler. But no, it's a really well done movie. So to get back to your point of how did they do this, the production on this movie was incredible. The team that got into who got this rolling, the directors and the producers and all that, it was intended that when they started on this process, well, the big thing about this movie is it was filmed by 2 film crews. An American film crew would film the American side of stuff, the Washington scenes, the Navy scenes leading up to the attack. The Japanese would film, edit, direct, write, cast the Japanese side of things, and when necessary, the teams would work together to film, certain scenes, but it allows us to see a very unbiased view of how the Americans were interpreting events and how the Japanese were interpreting events. And it's done. One of the things, we watched this along with Jared, and we mentioned at part of the film, and again, it's weird to say this because there's always going to be people out there that's like, you're humanizing the enemy. Brr, they did terrible things. But it was weird to see especially a Pacific War movie that humanizes the Japanese. Because again, we've talked about this on previous MASH episodes, because of the fallout from World War II, or not fallout from World War II, but because of the events of leading up to World War II and the propaganda, there is this sense of the Japanese were these, forgive my language, these savages who were barbaric and brutal. And if and after the war, hearing all the stories of veterans who served in the Pacific saying just how god awful fighting in the Pacific was against the Japanese, it created this stigma that you see in media about the Pacific War, even up to the modern day, even in the show The Pacific, the Band of Brothers Sister show that takes place in that conflict. The Japanese are this terrifying, almost force of nature that the Marines and the Navy have to fight, when in reality they're just another military force. And we'll get to it in the film. You see that the Japanese are excited. They're much like at the beginning of Band of Brothers, you see that a bunch of these soldiers are excited to be taking the fight to the Germans. The Japanese were excited to be the aviators and seamen were excited to be taking the fight to the Americans, and it's interesting to see that. There are a few other films that do it well. Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima are kind of sister movies. That those two do it really well. And then actually Midway, both the 1976 movie and the more recent, I think 2019 Midway, I think did a good job of not making the Japanese to quote an article that was shared with us by Mike Jameson about a certain director and a certain TV show we talk about regularly. Those movies and this movie do a good job of not making the Japanese the brown-skinned other bad guy. There's more nuance to it. Right. And again, based on the 5-minute tirade I just went on, you understand why I find World War II so fascinating. So yeah, this film had 2 film crews, American and Japanese, and I think and weirdly, it's a G-rated film. It is not violent. It is. It is. It got canned when it was released because it was very much a lot of sitting and talking, and then a lot of action at the end.
Yeah,
But if
it's not a normal plot structure, but it tells such an incredible story. You
Mhm,
know, it's not the typical movie, and I don't think I want it to be. I don't think, you know,
mhm.
I don't think I'd ever want it to be anything other than what it is.
There is a slew of war movies that fall into this Tora, Midway, The Longest Day, uh, A Bridge Too Far. These war movies that have these big ensemble casts and kind of tell the story of a broad part of the war or a large scale attack from the viewpoint of many individual characters, which doesn't mean other war movies are bad. Movies like uh, Band of Brothers that follow a specific unit per se are also equally good, but there's something amazing to see how the whole big picture is played out across a wide viewpoint of people, if that makes sense. So, especially when the movies are done with historical accuracy in mind. So, and yes, I am purposely avoiding comparing Tora to a certain other film that may or may not have depicted the attacks of Pearl Harbor, directed by a certain Michael Bay. If I talk about that movie on this podcast, I will scream at volumes not ever heard before by the human ear. So we're going to avoid talking about that movie. Don't watch that movie. That movie doesn't exist. Go watch Tora instead. I beg of you.
Good thing Michael
So
Bay isn't real.
Michael Bay is very real and he can hurt you. Do not watch the Pearl Harbor movie. um so yeah, I I'm going to get into the events of the movie and breaking down the history because it is I have very general notes, and Ethan and listener, if you find a part of this fascinating and want more detail, ask me, reach out to us and I can expound upon it either on Twitter or in a DM or give you a source or talk about it on the next episode, a little follow-up. But please, I have very general notes because again, this is a century's worth of events that led to this that I'm going to be very quickly summarizing. And I need to silence my phone because someone just sent me a message.
It was me. I wanted to text you. Give you a
No.
little smooch.
Okay, so Tor opens. First thing I want to point out, the music in this movie is fantastic. It is wonderful. This mix of military and Japanese instruments and American military style music, it's chef's kiss. The film opens, and I didn't really point this out last night because I wanted to be sure of the timeline. This film starts in November 1940, so a year and 1 month before the attacks. So everything we see takes place over the course of a year, for reference. This opening ceremony is for the exchange of command. The Japanese Imperial Navy is receiving a new commander, a name that, even if you're remotely associated and knowledgeable about World War II, you will recognize Japanese Admiral Izuruku Yamamoto. He is very competent, very capable for this job, which is why he was assigned there. To give you a very brief kind of overview, he has been in various roles in the Japanese Navy for the last decade or more. He was educated partially at Harvard in the United States and served as a naval attaché in the United States. While in the U.S., he studied American culture and business and military strategy and learned English. He is the best person to form an opinion on how the Navy could fight the United States. And he came to the conclusion very early on, not a good idea. So, knowing that going into the movie, you can understand why a lot of the things he says are very hesitant about the idea of fighting the United States. He and there's a really nice little conversation later in the film we'll point out, but basically Yamamoto has been transferred to control the Navy, and as we see in the conversations that occur after the ceremony takes place, that he is not popular in Tokyo with the army, who has a lot of sway and control in the government. But how did we get here? There's a lot of history and nuance that lead up to November of 1940, and I'm going to kind of chronologically go through it real quick because it's going to provide us a lot of context going forward. So, Ethan,
Yo,
first of all, what do you know of pre-World War II Japanese history?
what I learned in The Last Samurai,
Okay,
which was
actually,
not
okay. So weirdly, I love the last. Hang on, I love The Last Samurai. It's such an interesting movie. There are things about it you can nitpick, but I'd say for the context of that movie will help you understand some of what I'm about to talk about. Is it
Okay.
a perfect historical guide? Absolutely not. Still pretty interesting though. So I had to choose a starting point, and it's super hard to. So I chose the very obvious starting point. Through the beginning of the 1800s, for a couple hundred years previously, the Japanese islands were very isolated. It was the wish of the shogunate and the emperor to keep Japan insular. The kingdoms of China and Korea at the time were also very similarly isolationist. They didn't want external conflict. They didn't want external influence. They wanted their cultures to remain kind of to themselves. Japan had a very, very feudal-like caste system. The emperor was the divine supreme being who ruled very much in a ceremonial capacity most times. The shogun was the military leader. You had daimyos controlling different samurai houses, and the samurai, who were the warrior class. Below them you had the artisans and the farmers who fed and built things for the people. And believe it or not, the lowest class were the merchants. So Japan
Huh.
had this structure. They had these rules in place. The samurai were basically free to basically medieval knights, but Japanese. They could go around. They had not really diplomatic authority, but they had this presence, and they had rules that said basically the samurai could, in essence, do whatever they wanted because they were the hand of the daimyo, who were the hand of the shogunate, who was really running Japan. All that changes on July 8th, 1853. Guess who came a knocking with 4 gunboats to the coast of Japan, Ethan? You'll never guess.
The People's Republic of Taiwan.
No. Of course, this would be none other than the good old United States of America. Peace through superior firepower. All that jazz. No, famously, Commodore Perry sailed to Japan and it was kind of two-handed. One, he was sending a message of friendly diplomatic relations from the U.S. president and the U.S. government. We would like to trade with you, Japan. It would be very nice to extend our country's hand and become world neighbors and world friends. And then, in the other hand, he handed them a white flag and said, "If you don't open your borders, we're going to fight you, and you're going to need that." So, so it was very. Basically, it was a threat. Open your country up to trade with the U.S. or else. After a period of a couple months and discussions and treaties and back and forth, the United States and Japan came to a loose agreement that some cities would be open to Western trade, but not the entirety of Japan. Basically, little ports of entry, if you think about it. But in essence, as with all history of nations interacting, once you fire that gun, so to speak, you can't undo it. Once Western technology and influence and religion and firearms and military strategy and all that jazz started rolling into Japan, it was inevitable everything that would happen after. It was just a matter of how quickly and with how much bloodshed it would happen. So, not too long after that, in 1868, over the decade and a half of Western influence, Western technology, Japan would start to send diplomatic missions out to Western and European and United States, and they came back and basically said, "We're fucked. We need to industrialize fucking now," because they saw that if a Western power wanted to invade Japan, they could, just no problem, zero issue. So you started to have this argument develop between the various factions in the Japanese home islands. How much Western influence do we have? A lot, a little, none? How can we keep our traditions but prepare ourselves for an inevitable conflict with the West? How do we trade with the West without there being there was all these different frustrations that ultimately led to, and again, I am glossing over a lot of detail. I will provide sources where you can learn more about this. But essentially, this culminated in January 27th, 1868. The Boshin War started simultaneously also during what is called the Meiji Restoration. Meiji was the emperor, grandfather of Emperor Hirohito, who we will know from World War II. But essentially, Emperor Meiji said, we got to westernize, we got to modernize our army and navy, we got to rework how our government works to be more ready to join the world stage, because it is going to happen whether we want it to or not. And a lot of the daimyos and samurai families and lords said, that basically means we don't have any power anymore. We're not down for that. So the Boshin War was essentially the loyalist government of Japan and the emperor against the anti-reformist groups that were a lot of the samurai clans. And ignoring some of the historical inaccuracies of The Last Samurai, you saw how well that worked out.
Worked out great.
It was a war of attrition. The samurai put up a good fight, but ultimately, once they realized that the loyalist forces had the direct support of the emperor, you now get into this conflict that we're going to see again and again of, it doesn't matter what you believe, you do what's right by your emperor. So a lot of the samurai, when they realized the emperor was 100% on board with restoration and gave backing to the loyalist forces, and the loyalist forces were acting with the blessing of the emperor, it threw everything into chaos. Because like, we're not fighting the emperor. We're okay with fighting the other samurai, but if the emperor has given them their blessing, we're basically fighting the emperor, and that's a big no-no. Right. So it's this whole thing. By 1877, there was a bit of stabilization where the major warring samurai got booted, and then in 1877 you had what's called the Satsuma Rebellion, which are the last kind of holdouts that initially went with the loyalist government, but then as more and more and more restrictions on the samurai clans, those final rules that really outlawed the samurai clans and removed all their special privileges, you had those last group of holdouts finally rebel, and over the course of about 6 months, that I believe the Satsuma Rebellion is what is depicted in the Last Samurai, if I'm remembering correctly, but don't quote me on that. By 1889, the Japanese government had realized that, okay, we've started to modernize, we've started to industrialize, we have factories, we have a population boom, but a lot of the world governments aren't taking us seriously because we don't really have a formal government. We have the emperor and his council, but there's not really a structure to it. So by 1889, in February, the Japanese wrote out the Meiji Constitution, essentially their formal governing document. So this would create essentially a cabinet and a parliament and a system of who's in charge of what. That was very Western. And again, this propelled Japan to be a minor power on the world stage. Any questions so far, Ethan? I just covered a very tumultuous time in Japanese history in about 8 minutes.
No, I feel pretty good. Commodore Perry, white flag, 4 gunboats, good couple of rebellions, and now Western influence, but there's still an emperor.
Good, good. There will be a test after this.
Oh, fuck yeah.
Through the early 1900s, Japan started to flex that colonial power muscle, if you will. They fought the first Sino-Japanese War, first war against China, essentially. They would then fight the Russo-Japanese War, where very famously the Japanese would defeat the Russian fleet brutally. They would basically do a Pearl Harbor style surprise attack on the Russian naval base at what the heck is there? Eastern naval base. I suddenly forgot. Vladivostok. At Vladivostok, I believe that's where they did it. Stand by. I'm going to confirm that.
You could say literally any name and I would believe you because I don't know.
Yeah, but the internet, Ethan. You cannot be wrong on the internet. Not a good call. Let me confirm this. Port Arthur. See, I was wrong. It's the Battle of Port Arthur. Admiral Togo would very famously crush the Russian Navy at the Battle of Port Arthur. And this is an important fact. Japan issued their declaration of war on the 8th of February, 1904. However, 3 hours before Japan's declaration of war was received by the Russian government, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the Russian Far East Fleet. Remember that historical precedent because it will be important about things that happen later.
I doubt that.
And then when Russia sent their Baltic Sea fleet to reinforce the Far East Command, they were absolutely destroyed by the Japanese Navy. Stand by one. My dad just tried to call me.
Heck yeah.
So Sino-Japanese, Russo-Japanese War. So by the start of World War I, Japan had some military prowess. They had proven that they are not just some other backwater Asian nation. In fact, they are the first Asian power to defeat a European power by defeating the Russians. So not a small achievement on the world stage by far. The next major thing in Japan's kind of world place on the world stage was their involvement in World War I. They were technically an ally. I'd say technically. They were an ally in World War I. Their major contribution was some convoy escort and seizure and eventual colonization of a lot of German holdings in China and other islands in the Pacific. But here's where things start to not go so great. During the Treaty of Versailles, Japan was kind of put on the back burner. It was not considered as highly in the negotiations as, say, the major Western powers were. America, Britain, France, Belgium, all these places. So they lost out on a lot of spoils of war, which kind of irritated them. And then when the League of Nations was founded, one of the things they fought for is for there to be a specific written mention in the charter that all nations would be seen as equal, irregardless of race, which was not added to the charter. The League of Nations would become very controversial to some for sanctioning actions of European and United States powers. But when other countries of more ethnic varieties tried to do similar things, for example, when China wanted to annex Manchuria, they were told, no, bad. But when France and England wanted to annex parts of the Middle East during the Sykes and Picot Agreement, the League of Nations was like, yes, this is fine, this is good, do that. Which, if anyone is paying attention to any of 20th or 21st century history, nothing bad ever happens when nations go and just draw lines on a map in the Middle East somewhere and say that that's how things are going to be forever now. Nothing bad ever happens when that happens.
He's right. I looked up what he's saying, and what he's saying is 100% true.
So after World War I, we enter this again, lots of detail that I'm going to have to gloss over, but it's, in general terms, it'll help understand kind of where Japan is going into World War II. You had a lot of political unrest. Part of the Meiji Constitution that caused part of this problem was the military, the Army and the Navy, particularly the Army, were separate entities. They did not have civilian oversight. They acted directly in the interest of the emperor and basically subverted. It was written into the Constitution that the military was not under the control of the cabinet directly. It was only under the direct control of the emperor, who gave orders to, the minister of war, general of the army, all that jazz, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which means the army can dictate politics on their terms. This would lead to a lot of, essentially, this period was government by assassination. You had the civilian leadership that was trying to diplomatically deal with Japan's problems. You had, during this time is when you had start to have the separation of far left ideas and far right ideas in a lot of politics. See, Italy, Germany, the United States also had this problem. You had a lot of nationalist groups in the 20s and 30s and a lot of socialist groups in the 20s and 30s. The Americans did have a Nazi party at one point, right up until we declared war, and then that suddenly disappeared.
Could you go into just a little bit? That's kind of confusing to me. Like
there are. I will send you details on this later, but there are video, TV newsreels of in the early 30s American Nazi Party rallies in America. But instead of big portraits of Adolf Hitler, they were big portraits of George Washington and American flags, and it was very unsettling, especially to watch nowadays.
I'm really glad we don't have anything like that now.
Yep. Again, moving past controversial politics. So this was happening all over the world, which is why we got the rise of fascism and socialism and these dictators in all these countries. But it was also happening in Japan, and it's overlooked a lot because when you talk about the rise of fascism in nations, no one did it better than Germany and Italy. Like, they're the poster children. And the difference is Japan maintained a civilian government. The Japanese and the Germans basically had a military dictatorship. The Italians had a military dictatorship. The Japanese did not have a full strength military was in control of everything. There were civilian and military arguments all the way up through the end of World War II. They never had full control of the Japanese government system. But they didn't have to because they could act without civilian oversight. It's again, lots of detail, not a lot of time to cover all of it. But essentially what you had happen was you had factions form in the Japanese army. Some who believed that the will of the emperor was being clouded and misinterpreted by these civilian leaders. So you had these low-level Japanese officers who started to incite incidents. They would assassinate political leaders in the name of the emperor. They would bomb railways in China to try to incite military action. During all of this, you had the Kanto earthquake of 1923 that basically destroyed one of the biggest trading ports, Yokohama, and the capital city, Tokyo. So you had all this political upheaval going on, and finally, in September of 1931, the Japanese bombed another railway in China, incited another fight with the Manchurian and Chinese troops, and essentially because of this, the League of Nations said, "Hey, Japan." In February 1933, they said, "Hey, Japan, we've been investigating this incident for about a year and a half now, and yeah, you're to blame for this, and you incited this and acted not in self-defense, which is not what a member of the League of Nations is to do." And they're like, "Yeah, that's cool, cool, cool. We're out," and they left the League of Nations that same day.
Oh, cool.
Which, that governing body Woodrow Wilson uh, campaigned for to help prevent another world war. This just kept happening. Political assassinations, and a lot of these military officers, they were not like a general marching in and trying to take over. They were like lieutenants, colonels, majors. They were low-level officers who believed in the will of the emperor. And what would happen is you'd get these military tribunals where they would admit that they killed the prime minister or the head of a government department or an ambassador, or they'd admit to these things, but they would make these passionate arguments, and these courts kind of turned into a lot like Hitler's trial after the beer hall putsch, where he just used the trial as a means to kind of express his views and get people on his side. Similarly, these young Japanese officers would say, "I am doing this for my emperor. The civilian government is failing us." And it started to get a lot of people thinking like, yeah, the military is the only one kind of taking action in the interest of the Japanese people and of the emperor. So instead of getting the death penalty for murder, they would get 10-year prison sentences for rebellion and mutiny. So it set this precedent that as long as you believed you were acting in the interest of the emperor, if your motivation was pure, you could do these things and not get in trouble, which set a really not good precedent. It gave unintentionally gave the military a lot of power to just decide what was going to happen.
Well, and it's funny because we kind of saw a little bit of that in the movie, and you pointed out in a couple of scenes, but to have that kind of context really puts it in perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, so instead of the diplomats trying to negotiate trade deals or negotiate a colony in Manchuria, the military said, "Oh, the Japanese people need land in Manchuria to produce more goods, buy more grain, get more resources. Cool, let's just invade Manchuria." And the civilian government's like, "No, you can't just fine, but don't invade anything else." And they kept invading stuff. But the thing you have to remember is there was a political reason that the Japanese military was doing this, but there wasn't a tactic. There was not a strategy to it. It was, we want Manchuria, go get Manchuria, but there wasn't what is the end goal? Are we taking over all of China? Are we annexing this one part? Are we going to try to broker peace once we get enough land? Basically, it was called the Chinese quagmire because they got to a point where the only option for Japan to keep what they initially wanted out of the deal was to fight all of China and conquer all of China, which there was no way the Japanese were going to be able to do. Remember that, it's going to be important for later. You have all this happening. There's assassinations, different people coming in and out of power. By 1937, everything boils over, and it's still not clear historically what exactly happened, but you have what is called the Marco Polo Bridge incident at the border of, at that time it was called Manchukuo, which is the Japanese territory in Manchuria, and Chinese national forces. They started shooting at each other. One side called for reinforcement. Another side called for reinforcement. One side called for artillery. The other side called for artillery, and boom, we have the Second Sino-Japanese War. This is where you get all those lovely historical events like the rape of Nanking, all those good things. Yeah. So another thing that a lot of people don't know, and I actually learned this first from a gentleman who I had the opportunity to meet a few years ago and I look up to and I think is one of the most incredible people I've ever met. The last surviving member of the USS Arizona, former quartermaster third class, now lieutenant commander retired Lou Conter. He lives just like a 45-minute drive from here from me. And he is the first person that pointed this historical event out to me. So in July of 37, Marco Polo Bridge incident, Second Sino-Japanese War. December 12th, 1937. After the Boxer Rebellion, which was a conflict between China and the U.S., in the early 1900s, it was agreed that U.S. Navy patrol boats could patrol the coastal waters and rivers of China to protect U.S. trade. They would escort oil tankers and merchant ships in and out of Chinese territorial waters, just as a safety precaution. Well, essentially these British and American gunboats were sailing through the Sino-Japanese War. They were flying their colors. It was understood that they are non-combatants. They cannot be fired upon. Well, somehow, while evacuating diplomats and reporters and 3 standard oil tankers out of the Yangtze River, the Japanese just, accidentally bombed the 3 tankers and the USS Panay.
As you do,
despite the USS Panay radioing Japanese forces and securing safe passage and making sure that they were identified well as an American ship, flying 3 U.S. flags, despite all that, somehow a mistake was made. It is theorized that maybe it was another one of these low-level Japanese officers trying to incite something, but it was diplomatically smoothed over. It happened near Christmas. The Japanese government offered a formal apology and paid indemnities for the lost vessels and crew. And the holiday spirit kind of tempered the reaction to it, because the Japanese people and government were genuinely horrified that it happened. And they I don't want to say backpedaled, but they very much tried really hard to save face after it. But yeah, there were the first kind of shots fired between the U.S. Navy and Japan could arguably the USS Panay. Again, things keep escalating. There's all sorts of stress and discussion and diplomacy and frustration. You get to 1939. The Japanese war in China is not ending, so Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, orders that all U.S. commercial trade with Japan will stop. So appliances, civilian goods, that stuff. Oil, steel, raw materials, yes, but basically, if it's a commercial good, nope, you're not getting any of it anymore. Later that year, in September of 1939, Germany invades Poland. And in April of 1940, the U.S. Pacific Fleet is moved from its home base in San Diego and Long Beach to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The reason I say that Pearl Harbor was inevitable is you had Japan and America at the same time in the late 1800s entering the Pacific for the first time. Japan was isolationist. America didn't get to the Pacific coast of the continent until the 1840s and then had to fight the Civil War. So both of these countries are trying to expand into the Pacific at the same time, which is a lot of the reason a lot of this gets set up. While America was expanding into the Pacific, they fought the Spanish-American War in 1898. They got the Philippines and a bunch of other holdings out of it, including Guam and Wake Island. And to help create a supply chain to those islands is how we got the eventual annexation of Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. So you had these two empires basically growing toward each other. So the conflict was kind of inevitable, but it was still temporarily not coming to blows. So again, checking in with Ethan. Ethan, thoughts so far?
There is a lot to take in.
Yeah. I believe I said when we were watching the movie that I think Pearl Harbor is one of those fixed points in time.
Yeah.
There's no alternate timeline for Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor had to happen. As shitty as that is to say, a Pearl Harbor is a to use a I believe a Marvel term or a superhero term, then a Nexus event. All timelines cross at Pearl Harbor, I think. It's just the Japanese culture and militarism and colonization and expansion that they wanted to do, and the American plan of isolationism, but also Franklin Roosevelt not wanting to let nations like Japan and Italy and Germany do the crap they were doing. Like, it was inevitable that this was eventually going to happen. But as the problem that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is having is the U.S. after World War I is isolationist. They do not want to get involved in a war that does not concern them. The best Franklin Delano Roosevelt can do is the Lend-Lease program, which, if you're not familiar, is essentially all our old war equipment gets shipped to Britain and France and all these other nations that are fighting, much like we are doing with, say, Ukraine today. That's the best he can do because America was not willing to fight a foreign war. Even up into the late 1941, they weren't. But he was taking a lot of actions behind the scenes to prepare for what he knew was eventually going to have to happen. And a lot of people in the military and the government knew had to happen eventually, which was we are going to have to get involved, and it will probably be a two-ocean war. We are probably going to go to war with Germany. We are probably going to go to war with Japan. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt did a lot of things. He moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor. He reinstated the draft in 1940. It was on pause after World War II. He signed the Two-Ocean Navy Act, which would increase the size of the entire U.S. naval fleet by 75%, with an emphasis on aircraft carriers and naval aviation. And Japan saw this and went, shit, we currently outnumber the U.S. Navy in 2 to 3 years. That's not going to be the case. If we are going to do something, we need to do it soon. And a lot of people in the Navy and the Army said, well, we want to strike south toward the British holdings in Singapore. Because you have to remember, once Germany got involved with France and England and the Netherlands, now it's looking more tasty and juicy for Japan to dive down and take their holdings while they're distracted with Germany. Well, if we're going to do that, why not simultaneously take out the big, giant guard dog that is the U.S. Navy sitting at the other end of the Pacific waiting for us to do something? So a lot of Japanese officers started whispering, well, what if we could not win, not beat the Americans, but delay them long enough that we basically could negotiate on our terms? That was kind of the thought going into late 1940. It wasn't really official yet, but it was starting to get talked about. After France fell in 1940, in September, Japan would invade Indochina, so Cambodia, Vietnam, that area. They would later in September, they would sign the Tripartite Pact, officially allying them with Italy and Germany. Like we said, we're now caught up to movie time. November 1st, or November 1940, Admiral Yamamoto is made commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet. So, again, that was a half hour of very general history over the course of about a century.
No, fuck yeah, I loved it.
But I hope that now there's kind of an understanding of how we got to where we are in the movie. Again, there is hours of things that you could watch to get better information. I will share them in the description of this video. I will tell you what they are when we get to the end, but that was, I knew going into this movie I would have to do a little half-hour chat on how did we get here, because it's so fascinating. And if any of that sounded interesting or you're hearing it for the first time, please go into the description and look at some of the links I'm going to leave for you. It is so, I'm going to go on a little rant at the end of the episode about why I think it's important you should go do that, but understand that everything I just read is so fascinating to me. Like how geopolitically the path to Pearl Harbor started in 1850. Like it's mind-boggling to me. But so we are now back in time with the movie. Admiral Yamamoto is commander-in-chief of the Japanese Imperial Fleet, including its aircraft carriers. And he is educated and has studied in America and knows that the Army wants war with America. War with America is probably inevitable, but he understands that there is a very narrow margin of chance that we can actually win this war. Our next scene is meeting some of our key players. You meet Prince Konoye, who is Prime Minister. You also meet at that time Minister of War Tojo, who would eventually become Prime Minister as we get closer to the events of Pearl Harbor. But even then, in November 1940, they are already starting to discuss the plans to invade south toward the British holdings. And the reason they're able to do this, some historical context the movie doesn't give us, is on November 11th, 1940, a German commerce raider raided a British ship in the South Pacific and took diplomatic documents that showed basically the entire colonial government's plans for defending their holdings in Southeast Asia. And the conclusion was, we cannot win a war with Japan. And because they're allies, Japan got that information and went, we need to strike now. We need to go now. We need to go now. If we want these holdings, Germany's kicking the bejesus out of these guys already. We can swoop in and take them. And because we're allied with Germany and they're winning right now, there's not a whole lot anyone can say or do about it. So they started planning for what they called the Southern Strike. The next day, this is another one of those keep it in mind for later. On November 12th, 1940, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, would launch an attack in the Mediterranean on the port of Taranto, Italy. This attack would constitute naval-launched swordfish, torpedo, and bombers to strike the Italian Navy at their home port. Remember this. It's a surprise tool that will help us later.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, naval power kicks the bejesus out of another naval power with a surprise naval aviation attack. Where have we heard that one before? Fast forwarding several months through the end of 1940 into 1941, again, tensions are heating up. The U.S. and Japan are doing the diplomatic thrust and parry. World War II, as far as the Western Front in Europe is concerned, France has fallen. The continent is under German control. The Battle of Britain's going to start up soon. In Pearl Harbor, the Japanese embassy takes on a new vice chancellor, Tadashi Morimura, whose real name is Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa of the Japanese Navy. He enjoys very strange hobbies for a diplomat, flying a private aircraft around the island, swimming in the channel waters outside Pearl Harbor. He lives strangely far from the consulate, 8 miles away in a second-story apartment that overlooks Pearl Harbor. Totally normal things for a diplomat to do.
Yes.
And he has this funny little typewriter that when you press one letter on it, a different letter gets typed on the paper. Very weird. Very strange man. And he sends a lot of diplomatic cables back to Tokyo. Like a lot. Like so many. Weirdly not about like trade or like what Japanese citizens are concerned about who, immigrated to the US. No, lots of like stuff about ships and torpedo nets and like maps of the harbor for some reason.
Anthony, I'm going to stop you right there. I don't see how this has any possible bearing on the rest of our discussion. I think you're fixating on it a little too much. Let the man be a diplomat. That's all I have to say.
But yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. I started going down my timeline. I forgot we were talking about a movie. So yes, I mentioned the next scene we see is the Japanese signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. This is concerning to our first U.S. characters. We meet Secretary of, I believe it's Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Secretary of War Henry Stimson. These Cordell Hull and the two Japanese diplomats we're going to meet, I feel so bad for Kurusu and Nomura, and I'll explain why later. But essentially, this is the beginning of Japan trying to figure out if there is any way to get a diplomatic solution with America. You hear that Kurusu and Hull have been going back and forth, offers, counter offers, one set of demands, another set of demands. So this is kind of the start of that in the late 1940s, early 1941, of Japan starting to seek out the last attempts to come to a diplomatic solution, because the military is already making plans to come to a military solution. We learn about magic, the code, the breaking of the Japanese naval code. This is one of those moments where I look at World War II and go, anyone who thinks the Axis powers could have won is insane. The technological, logistic prowess of specifically America, but the Allied nations as a whole, was unfreaking believable. The war hasn't even started, and we're reading all the Japanese communications, encoded communications. By, I think 1942, we've broken the German code, and we know where all their U-boats are. We know what all their troop movements are. Like, the fact that anyone thinks the Axis powers could have won World War II is ridiculous to me.
Is that like a school of thought? I mean, is that debated?
There are some people who, Japan not so much. Japan was 100%. They, like I said, there were a lot of people in the Japanese military who wanted war with America, but there were also a lot that knew we could not sustain war with America. We would be lucky to maintain what we have if we fight America. There are a lot of people that say if the Germans develop jet fighters sooner, or if, insert different tactical, if they kept the non-aggression pact with Russia and didn't open a second front, blah, 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 blah. Here's what it comes down to. If Germany was still a threat in August of 1945, there would be a 5-mile wide crater where Nuremberg is now. I say that kind of as a joke, but Germany was always the first priority. If Germany was still kicking ass and taking names in August of 1945, one of our 2 nuclear weapons would have been dropped in Germany. I am convinced of that. We were not going to put up with that. More realistically, probably Hamburg, the port of Hamburg. But anyway. I'm not saying that's the right thing. I'm saying that we dropped a nuclear device on Japan because we did not want to commit more troops to a long and devastating invasion of Japan. If Germany was still holding out and we could not break through, we were not going to commit another thousands and thousands and thousands of American and Allied lives to continuing to fight Germany. That's just the case. There's no Wunderweapon. There's no secret attack plan. There's no Steiner's reinforcements coming to none of that crap that you hear people argue. It's like, if Germany had built more Tigers. No. Germany didn't have enough steel, they didn't have enough oil, they didn't have enough manpower, and they were being led by a man who didn't trust his generals and would fire them and make his own tactical decisions that made no goddamn sense. Germany could not have won World War II. Japan could have not won World War II. Italy certainly could not have won World War II. I hate arguing with people about this. Yes, the Wolfenstein games and Man in the High Castle are really fun fictions, not realistic. They just aren't, sadly. But anyway, we learned that essentially the U.S. Navy, the U.S. military is intercepting more Japanese communication than they can decrypt. They know everything if they want to. But the problem we're going to see is there's this disconnect that the American military and government knows that there is going to be a war, knows that they have to get involved at some point. They're going to be dragged into it somehow. In some of the conversations I've heard some of the stories I've heard Lou Conter tell, as a quartermaster on the Arizona, he and his shipmates knew they were probably going to be fighting Japan. One of the men he said he served with was on the USS Panay. They knew war was coming. They were training for it. They knew that the Navy was getting more ships. They knew they were moved to Pearl Harbor for a reason. The thing that as we get further into this movie that I know we watched happen like 7 times is how close. Like, one person had this bunch of information, this person had this bunch of information, this person had a little bit of both, but no one quite connected the dots fast enough. And it's one of those things that convinces me that Pearl Harbor is this nexus point, this fixed point in the timeline because of just how it went down. But yeah. We see that the decision to attack Pearl Harbor is becoming more of a reality in Japan. They're doing torpedo runs. They're practicing. We get those lovely geisha girls that Ethan got really excited about.
Okay, geishas aside, I do have a question for you. It's jumping the gun a little bit, but I feel like that's okay. There is a line later on in the movie where they discuss, I believe, torpedoes and why that's farcical because Pearl Harbor is only 40 feet deep.
Yes.
But we are currently, we just passed the scene where they are doing torpedo drop tests.
Yes.
So is that Japan developed a higher depth of
lower depth
torpedo?
So the trick is, and a lot of people don't realize this because movies and video games are really bad at depicting this. A torpedo, when it's dropped in the water, it dives. If you've ever, growing up, we used to have these little pool toys that were essentially torpedoes, and if you threw them in the water right, they would zoom through the water because they're hydrodynamic. They'll just shoot through the water if they hit the water the right way. What a military torpedo does at that time, it would drop out of the airplane. You had to be flying at the right height and the right speed so it hit the water at the right angle. But essentially, it would dive about 70 to 80 feet and then kind of become neutrally buoyant at the correct. It would kind of arc back up to their correct depth. So the problem is, so the torpedo runs a few feet under the water, like 10 feet under the water, 20 feet under the water. Shallow enough to hit the hull of a ship, but deep enough that it's underwater and can do its job. The problem isn't that, it's that before it gets to the running depth, it plunges and has to come back up. If the Japanese just dropped torpedoes in Pearl Harbor, they would plunge straight into the mud. They would not climb back up to that running depth. What the Japanese did is they developed a naval torpedo, essentially, and again, this is one part I forgot to look up, but I'm doing this part from memory. They essentially modified their torpedoes with these large wooden fins that were attached to the back of the torpedo that basically dampened their impact and would fall away once the torpedo was underway. So kind of like how if you jump off a diving board and your arms and legs are all straight, you'll plunge to the bottom real quick. Versus if you jumped with your arms and legs splayed, you go underwater, but you kind of decelerate quicker. That's basically what they did. They put these big wooden fins on the back of their torpedoes that when they hit the water, they plunged a little bit, but they didn't dive deep. They dove to like 30 feet and came back up. So it was, again, this is one of those moments where I'm like, damn, Japan, applause. Like they saw a problem and dealt with it. And I love how the movie does this. You see the USS Nevada doing colors. You then cut to the new commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Kimmel, being shown his new command, and him and the other admiral are discussing the recent British attack on the port of Toronto. And they're commenting on how very similar Pearl Harbor is to they're discussing that there is a possibility that Pearl Harbor has that same threat, but they also discuss that Pearl Harbor is so shallow. But they don't discuss it in like, the harbor is too shallow. We'll never be attacked here. They say the harbor's too shallow, true, but we're still worried. And then you immediately cut to the Japanese officers and admirals having that same discussion, but trying to solve the problem. And it's done in a way that explains to the audience this point of contention that the Americans didn't think this could happen because of this factor. Then it shows you the Japanese solving that problem, and it gives both sides credit for understanding why the Americans couldn't think it could happen, and how the Japanese, through their resolve and determination, made it so. That's one of the things I love about this movie. But so yeah, to answer your question, the depth of the torpedo was a problem, but the Japanese solved it.
Wow.
Because they had to.
Yeah.
Side note, in that shot where you see the Nevada playing colors in the morning, there is a large red and white painted water tower on Ford Island. I had the privilege, side note for the audience, I think I've talked about it before on the podcast. I had the immense privilege to travel to the 75th anniversary celebration of Pearl Harbor back in 2016 and met a lot of veterans of not just the Pacific War, but of the attack on Pearl Harbor specifically. One of the gentlemen I met, and I'm going to forget his name, and I'll look it up and put it on screen if I can find it. He was a part of a group of guys that just hauled rifles, pistols, submachine gun, whatever they could get up that water tower and started shooting back at Japanese planes. Dude, I'll be the first to say it. We're fucking weak, pansy little people compared to that generation. Jesus God. We are so soft.
Well, we're soft right now. World War III's on the horizon, and it's draft time. That's all I'm saying. But anyway.
So the Americans, it's hard to tell. It's tricky to figure out where we are timeline-wise in the movie. As the situation in the Pacific becomes more unsure, in early 1941, there is an alert sent out to all Naval Pacific commands, essentially saying, hey, something might attack you. Maybe, possibly, could be happening right now, but it was very vague, like, hey, we're trying to negotiate with Japan. They're being weird. Take precautions to potentially defend yourself. And the problem with that is every Far East command dealt with that warning differently. The Philippines thought it meant to be ready to provide air support to Singapore, so they had drills to launch a full tactical attack in defense of the British at Singapore. You had in Hawaii, we see Lieutenant General Walter Short, the Army commander of Hawaii. There's a really cool little museum on Oahu, by the way, just up the beach on Waikiki from the Hilton Hotel. It's one of the old Army gun battery forts. They turned it into a military museum specifically about warfare and military as it pertains to Hawaiian Islands. Go there. It's called the Fort DeRussy Museum. 100% worth walking through. But anyway, General Walter Short's response was he didn't fear that he would have to mobilize his troops or fight an invasion or an attack. His fear was, and this is where we get into interesting discussions, sabotage by Japanese citizens on the island of Hawaii. Now, if you've grown up in America, particularly on the West Coast, you know about this because we learn it in California history. The Japanese internment camps. Quite possibly, in hindsight, and I say that for a reason, in hindsight, Executive Order 9066 might be one of the most despicable things our government has done. Just once you learn about it, just not. If Ethan, you grew up learning this, am I wrong in saying it's? I don't feel like evil's not the right word when you compare what, say, other nations were doing at the time, but definitely not great.
Yeah.
Not, it's uncomfortable to talk about because it's admitting, yeah, our government did a really fucked up thing. And I am absolutely okay saying it's a really fucked up thing because it was a really fucked up thing.
Yeah, it was really fucked up, and it's very hard to find the right words because
Again,
you know,
I think you and I are in agreement. Having grown up in America, obviously, and being members of the Boy Scouts, which is very active in the community and Veterans Day celebrations and 4th of July celebrations and all this stuff and the citizenship stuff that scouting teaches you. I'm very patriotic. I love America, but I also am enough of a student of history to know that we have done some really fucked up shit, and that is one of the most fucked up things we have done is Executive Order 9066.
And mind you, this isn't to defend that action in any way, but I do just have to say there's very little room for morality in war other than in hindsight.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. I said in hindsight, Sarah, but because I didn't grow up then. A question I would love to ask Lieutenant Commander Conter. Not because I want to incite an argument or press him on something uncomfortable. I genuinely want to know, Lou, what did you think of the Japanese internment? Lou, what did you think of the atomic bombings of Japan? Because I cannot possibly comprehend that decision because I didn't live in that time. I didn't live in that time period where I was seeing this propaganda and hearing these news stories about if the Japanese invaded the West Coast, are they going to do the rape of San Francisco? All these news images would have been horrifying to hear about. And then you hear that Pearl Harbor got attacked. Is Pearl Harbor getting invaded tomorrow? Are they going to launch an invasion of this was real fears people had. And I can understand human nature. The other is scary. And when there are news reports saying the other is doing these terrible things, I don't agree, but I can understand how you could be walking down the street and if you saw a Japanese person, even maybe in your own prejudiced view, doing something that looked sketchy, being uncomfortable. I can understand that. I don't agree with it though. It's so hard to, and we had this discussion with MASH, both the movie and the TV show. I want to say that's evil and wrong, but again, I'm looking at it from the morality and the viewpoint and with the hindsight of someone 80 years in the future.
From my very limited research and understanding of this, there was never any Japanese person found guilty or convicted of espionage or sabotage against the U.S. Is that correct?
Yep. No Japanese American citizen. Nope. Never. In fact, remember I said earlier that in April of 41, they sent Ensign Yoshikawa to Hawaii to start getting intel on what ships were in the harbor, are there torpedo nets, that kind of stuff.
Right.
He specifically did not use Japanese American agents or try to recruit Japanese American agents because he thought they were too loyal to the U.S.
Wow.
Yep. So yeah, it's wild. Part of me I understand where people like General Walter Short are coming from. I am on an island far from my homeland with a limited military force. I could be attacked from the sea, I could be attacked from the air. This is true. There are also a couple 100,000 citizens on this island who, because of their ethnic background, might be loyal to then a potential enemy nation. I understand his concern in that sense. But it's, again, looking back on it 80 years later, you get that uncomfortable feeling in your stomach. And if you're ever in Sacramento, California, listener, go to the California History Museum. They have a great section, very well done, on the Japanese internment and how that affected the Japanese American citizens, both the first generation. Is it Issei and Nisei? Am I remembering that correct? Do you remember, Ethan? I know
That
Nisei is the second generation, born in America, the next generation after immigrants, because that's what they were.
Yeah.
They were the Nisei regiments, which, to tell the opposite side of that, a lot of the young Japanese men in the internment camps wanted to fight for the U.S., and there are many memorials around California and the West Coast for the is it the 442nd, I believe is the unit number, the 442nd Infantry Division, that was made up of all Japanese American volunteers, and they went to Germany. And there's a really good, I can't remember the name of the movie, but there's a really good movie about the 442nd Division, and there's a scene in the movie where these Japanese infantry squads, or Japanese American infantry squads led by white officers, assault this German position in Italy, and the Germans come out of the bunker with their hands up and look around, and they're like, what is this? And the American officer goes, oh, didn't you hear? Japan surrendered. They're fighting for us now. And the Germans are like, what the fuck? No, it's God, I'll have to look up the name of the movie now. I can't think of it, but yeah, it's the whole sabotage by Japanese Americans. I understand it from a strategic standpoint, but looking back on it, it is gross. It's just gross. But,
yeah. I think that's all that we
especially
can
because
say.
I don't think you can grow up in, especially our area. A lot of the fruit growers back then were Japanese American families. A lot of the orchards and a lot of the old fruit advertisements you see on the side of all the old warehouses down here are like the Mushido family orchards, or Machado, or like all these old Japanese American family names that are just gone, or not gone, but they would get taken away to the internment camps and their land would be sold off. And there's really good stories of American families trying to buy up their neighbor's land for them. But yeah, it was just a mess, just a disgusting mess.
Yeah.
But
I guess all there is to say is logically maybe, but what a horrible black mark on our history.
we then get to meet one of my favorite historical characters, at least in this movie, Admiral Halsey. He's such a goober, and I love him. Halsey and Kimmel have this interesting discussion of how are they going to be on alert, but not be on alert, but not provoke the Japanese, but also do reconnaissance. It's the military, especially the Navy, had its hands tied because you have to be ready to respond to a threat, but you don't know what the threat is. But we then see the Japanese officers, particularly, I'm going to get his name because, again, I can't find it in my notes. Genda. Genda was the one of the main strategists for the attack on Pearl Harbor, trying to decide how we would attack. And again, this is one of those other really interesting scenes in the movie. He's kind of talking through the attack to himself. We'll use torpedo planes, high-level bombers, dive bombers. We attack on a weekend when the base is the least staffed. We attack with 6 carriers. We sail north to avoid shipping lanes and then come down south. And in the next scene, what do you see the Americans discussing? Literally, that's their same assessment of how the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor if they did.
I got to tell you, that is probably my favorite scene in this movie. As beautiful and as incredible as some of the other shots are, it's just him sitting wrapped in a blanket, shirtless, sweating like a pig, figuring out his attack plan is it, it's just first of all incredible acting, second of all just mesmerizing to watch.
Yeah, and the next several minutes we get to see kind of this again, this thing I keep bringing up, that America had most of the pieces of the puzzle, they just didn't put them together.
Yeah.
They know that if Japan was going to do the crazy thing and attack Pearl Harbor, this is how they might do it. But a lot of people still thought it was a long shot. You would have to sail across the entire Pacific Ocean without being detected. You would have to get your airplanes launched without being detected. Your fleet would have to go undetected and not be considered missing. Like, it was such a bold ass move for them to try to attack Pearl Harbor. But again, as we'll get to there's a reason that the slogan is Remember Pearl Harbor. It's not just a remember the people who died at Pearl Harbor. It's remember to be alert and aware of what's going on. But that's my end of podcast diatribe. But so you have the Navy figuring out that this is how they might do it. You then see the naval aviation squadrons practicing their dive bombing, and the implication here is they're not very good at it.
No.
Not to discredit our sailors at the time, they were competent. Lou talks about this as they were ready. They were training. They were prepared when the time came to go to war. However, being prepared for something and being able to act are two different things. You and I know from memory a good chunk of first aid, Ethan.
Oh, yes.
Would you be able to calmly and efficiently stop an arterial bleed right now?
Adrenaline is a hell of a drug.
Adrenaline is a hell of a drug, but also, you know what I'm saying? So, yes, the American military was theoretically prepared, but especially in some of the early battles after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Coral Sea, it was very much, and the Battle of Wake Island and a bunch of stuff. It's the Americans were determined, but they were not, and they were ready, but they weren't. I don't want to say they weren't ready. I do not want to discredit our armed force. If you read up and watch any videos about the defense of Wake Island, because it was attacked simultaneously with Pearl Harbor, I don't want to discredit any of the soldiers or sailors who fought in those early days of the war. They were determined. They were ready to face an enemy, but the United States had not fought a foreign power since World War I.
Mm.
They were isolationists. The military budget was cut way back. At one point during the 30s, and I'll find this actual statistic. I forgot to pull it up. There were more registered members of the Boy Scouts of America than standing members of the U.S. Army. That is a documented thing. It's
That's
not that
absolutely
America
nuts.
wasn't prepared. They were not ready to fight a war in a we want to go to war sense. They had the tools, they could get the manpower, but they were not mentally ready, so to speak. They had the theory of how to fight, but they had not put it into practice yet. And that's kind of what the dive bombing scene is showing is, yeah, we got the planes, we got the bombs, we got the men. We don't know how quite to use them yet because we haven't had the opportunity to. We also see that the U.S. Army Air Corps has a new toy to play with, radar, which is a very, very, very brand new thing. It was being implemented by the British during the Battle of Britain to detect the incoming German bomber formations. It was being put by Germany, eventually would put, and the Allies. Germany kind of led the charge on this, though. They would start putting radar sets in their fighters for night operations. Again, you're not necessarily like shooting down an enemy with your radar. You are just kind of finding out what general direction they're in to go find them.
Mm.
But still, huge advantage. Because of the geography of Hawaii and limitations both geographic and political, as we see here, the National Park Service. Uh, they can only put their radar out in certain places, which limits their coverage, but at least they got radar up. It's still a new technology, and there's trust in it, but it's not considered a key part of defense. It is kind of just it's there because it's there. But yeah.
Well, yeah, it's another thing that that I have to remind myself that hindsight is 2020. You know, when when the uh, people manning the radar tower ask, "Well, what are we supposed to do if we see something?" Goes, "There's a gas mile. There's a gas
A
station a
gas
mile
station.
down the road. They probably have a phone." Just it's I don't know. It's comical,
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could say.
Give me just a second here. Okay. We then get a scene where we see Admiral Yamamoto coming in from what was clearly some sort of meeting. It is revealed that the Japanese army has decided to fully annex Indochina. Like we said before, they kind of started to. They have now fully annexed Indochina. Again, as is alluded to in the scene, the army is making most of the decisions at this point. They're just kind of deciding they saw an opportunity and took it. The big so something else that people don't realize is when they think of World War II, they think of the Allied armies having their disagreements and not communicating well, but for the most part, the different nations were in sync with their battle plan. Within the U.S. military, the Army, Navy, Air Corps, and Marine Corps were communicating. In the Pacific, it was the naval aviation, the Marine Corps, and then the Army would basically come in and occupy after the Marines had taken the land. For the most part, that's not a blanket statement. And then in Europe, it was the Army, Air Corps, the Bomber Command, and the Royal Navy and the U.S. Army working together to coordinate invading Europe, who was attacking what. There was a lot of inter-branch communication, right? Working together. Not at all what's going on in the Japanese military. The Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army not despised each other, but they were very much in disagreement of how to go about fighting a war in the Pacific. Obviously, the Japanese Navy is the Navy, and they want gunboat diplomacy. They want carriers and battleships and strength through projection of force. The Army wants the Navy to just, become a lot like the U.S. Navy in the Atlantic did: convoy escort, troop transport escort, naval invasion force. Those two things can coexist, but both sides were arguing for all the eggs to get put in one basket. And there's a whole lot of other stuff, but essentially the Army was making the decisions and the Navy was along for the ride, mostly unwillingly. So, yay. We then go back to Washington where we see, forgive me, I forget his name, and I want to make sure I get his name right. We have Colonel Rufus S. Bratton and not General Walter C. Short. That's the wrong person. Hang on. I had the list of characters because some of them are very important, some of them are slightly less important. I want to make sure I name them right. Lieutenant Commander Alvin D. Kramer. These two are I believe it's the Army representative and the naval representatives that are working on magic, for lack of a better description. They are getting messages in place, or they're starting to get messages that the Japanese military is up to something. Their Navy is starting to move. They've taken Indochina. They're starting to get a little spicier. So messages get sent out to commands. This is what we talked about before. The message gets sent out to commands that you need to take slightly more action. Another alert came out, and then we see the Hawaiian Islands go to full alert, which is essentially the aircraft, like we talked about, they were scared of sabotage, so all the aircraft get nestled together in the center of the field so they could be guarded by security forces, which is really great if you're trying to keep people from infiltrating the edge of the base and planting bombs. As, again, favorite line in the movie, Ethan. I think we're a little ahead of it, but the monkey hanging from a 10-cent balloon could scatter them all with one hand grenade. We get that in a while, but yeah, we're still a ways ahead of that, but still.
It's okay. I think we need to say it a few times for maximum effect.
But we see that they're clustering the aircraft together. The Navy is going to do more coastal patrols and some long range patrols with what aircraft they have. And the Territorial Defense Force of the islands is put on alert, which means the ground troops, the infantry, are going to go out and man shore batteries, anti-aircraft guns, machine gun nests. And the thing I like about this is, as you see the troops in these positions, you see them kind of just standing around shaking their head like, what the hell's going on? Because that's the thing. The basic boot level troop knows something's up, but they don't know what. And it's, again, I think this is fair. This is true in any job. If the managers aren't telling you what's going on, just telling you to do stuff without explanation, it gets frustrating.
Oh, yeah.
We then see the final, not the final, but kind of the big all admirals, all ships officers meeting for the fleet, discussing that we are going to attack Pearl Harbor, but the government, the emperor and the cabinet fear that if we commit all 6 of our carriers to one attack, there is a risk of losing some of them, and we cannot afford to lose a single vessel, especially a capital ship. So they are going to limit the attack force to 3 aircraft carriers, which, in hindsight, if they had attacked with all 6 carriers and done all the attack waves planned, again, I don't think Japan could have won their part of the Second World War, but it would have severely limited America's response and how quickly we could have responded. But it is essentially agreed Pearl Harbor is going forward. Whether or not the Navy believes it is a good idea, it is happening. And we see they bring all the flight commanders and all the officers on board and show them the attack plan and the map. They all stand up in shock because the day that they've been training for is finally. I'm sorry, I mixed up my scenes here. I said the geishas were earlier. Now they are starting to practice the attack runs.
Yes.
Earlier it was just torpedo training.
You can never mention the geishas too much.
Exactly. We see that the radar station is set up on Opana Point, but as Ethan pointed out, this is a new technology. They don't have the logistics set up yet. They got to get the phone lines hooked up. They got to train the men how to report. They got to set up a communication center to take those reports, and that isn't set up yet. So literally he tells them, just, walk to the nearest phone and call anything weird in. We see that there are some commanders who are trying to subvert the alert orders by, if the orders are keep all the planes in one spot, well, I can send some of my planes to other airfields to try to disperse them that way. So we see that some aviation is going to get dispersed. But again, it's a lot of, some people kind of see what's happening and trying to prepare for it, and other people are trying to follow orders, but maybe don't 100% see what's happening or don't believe that the worst an attack on Pearl Harbor could happen. It's, again, the way the movie goes about how disjointed things seem to feel is crazy.
Well, we also get the single most MASH scene out of the entire movie.
Which one is that? Oh, yes.
You know why we're being transferred? Them poker games.
Yeah, they're winning too many poker games, so they're getting transferred to another airfield. We then we jump to a scene back with Admiral Yamamoto and Prime Minister Konoye. This is actually fairly significant. It is, by this point, were in September of 1941. Some things that have happened since then. In April of 41, Japan signed a non-aggression pact with the USSR. And the reason that is important is at this time, Japan's biggest fear was a war with Russia because of manpower. Russia, as we've seen in history, just wave after wave of men. That's how they fight.
Yeah.
That they have that advantage. That's how they beat the Germans, was just relentless onslaught. But yeah, Japan and Russia signed a non-aggression pact, and it was hoped that if Russia and Japan were non-aggression with each other, Japan and Germany were allies, and Germany and Russia were non-aggression pact with each other. There was this little window before Germany invaded Russia that Japan thought that if we can all get on the same page, maybe we could convince Russia and Germany to join together and have a four-way Axis power, and have it be a group of totalitarian governments that were in mutual defense with each other. That would have majorly changed the game, but that did not happen. In July of 1941, you said it earlier, Ethan, Franklin Delano Roosevelt finally says this is going too far, because here is the weird place America was in. They were supporting the Chinese forces fighting against Japan. We were supporting.
What?
Yeah, we were supporting the Chinese forces fighting against Japan. We were sending them Lend-Lease equipment. At the same time, we're selling Japan oil. So finally, FDR says enough, oil embargo. And along with oil, it eventually became oil, steel, aluminum, all the raw materials for war. So now, essentially, the Japanese knew that if this happened, it starts a countdown. They have oil reserves, but they only have a certain amount. And they said, as soon as that oil flow gets cut off, we have a deadline. They estimated that at full combat maneuvering and full combat readiness, they had a year of fuel for their Navy. So if they were going to strike, it had to happen soon, before the U.S. fleet got more reinforced and before the Japanese ran out of oil and fuel. So this meeting where Yamamoto and Konoye are talking, they mention, this is in September of 1941, September 6th, the emperor read a poem to his cabinet. They were discussing, again, getting further down this trail of, we're running out of diplomatic options with the U.S. They're not meeting any of our terms. They're not coming to the table to discuss. We're getting closer to war being the only option, especially without oil now. So the emperor read a poem that his grandfather, Emperor Meiji, remember him, wrote, and it essentially was a poem about how the sea linked all people, the sea linked all nations. And the line in that poem that basically, essentially the line is, if all people are brethren, why are the waves and winds so turbulent? Basically saying war is not a good idea, was the emperor's intent with that. Yamamoto, he says, as I said a moment ago, he says, if we must fight a war, we can raise havoc with them for a year. And he's being very true. And in one of his statements that he made at one point, prior to this, much earlier to this, I found this statement that Admiral Yamamoto made very eye-opening. Soruku Yamamoto. Actually, no, this statement was made very close to this point, because it was right after Tojo became prime minister. He wrote a letter to a friend of his who is an ultra nationalist, essentially on the opposite side of thinking from him. He said, should hostilities break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, not even Hawaii or San Francisco. If we are to make our victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians who speak so lightly of a Japanese-American war have confidence as to the final outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. Now, Japanese media and the Japanese army clipped that last bit of the statement to make it seem like he was saying, if we are to win against the Americans, we must march on their capital. That's not what Yamamoto is saying.
Oh, boy.
That's not what he's saying. He's saying the Americans are not going to surrender to us unless we conquer them. And we cannot even hope to begin to do that.
So
Do you understand that the Americans are going to fight us until we are no more? Like, it's either we're conquering their capital or they're conquering ours. And one of those is for sure going to happen, and it's not the one you think.
So you're telling me that the media took a quote out of context?
Oh, no.
Say it ain't so.
Again, this is one of those fascinating bits of historical hindsight, because if you time traveled back to the mid-40s and asked an American serviceman what they thought of Admiral Yamamoto, murder. A plague upon you for 1,000 years, because he was the mastermind of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He did it because it was the wish of his government, of his people, and of his emperor. He was ordered to do it. He did not believe it was a good idea. He really did not. But he said, if Japan's going to commit to a war with the United States, this is our best option for potentially not getting our asses totally handed to us, is to knock out the American fleet early. So it's, again, these little nuances in history I fucking love. At this point, we see that we're back to Ambassador Kurusu, who I would like to point out right now. Ambassador Kurusu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States, he was friends with Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State. They were, Kurusu would go to Cordell's home. He would have dinner with him. They would have very heated but polite arguments about politics and diplomacy, and they were on good terms, which makes what happens so upsetting. But Kurusu gets a message from Japan essentially saying that in October of 1941, there was a last-ditch meeting with Prime Minister Konoye and a bunch of the cabinet and a bunch of military officers, saying we need a diplomatic solution. The Minister of War, Tojo, was like, look, we're going to war. If we don't have a diplomatic solution, we need to set a deadline for diplomacy, and if that deadline is passed, we need to go forward with this attack and these plans. 4 days later, on October the 16th, Prime Minister Konoye would resign, and Minister of War Tojo would be installed as the new Prime Minister. Much to his shock, and it was noted that after he got the position as Prime Minister and saw the whole picture and was now the guy in charge, he started to realize, oh, all right. It was also decided at that, I'm sorry, I'm confusing. This is Ambassador Nomura, not Kurusu. I'm so sorry. This gentleman in the white suit in this scene sitting on the couch, that is Prime Minister Nomura. I got the two Japanese prime ministers confused. Kurusu is the Japanese ambassador that went to Germany and signed on behalf of Japan the tripartite pact. I'm sorry. I just mixed those two names up. I'm sorry. Nomura is the one in Washington. Kurusu was at this meeting in Japan, and one of the things they decided is we're going to write up two resolutions. Both are calls for peace with terms that we're willing to accept. There's Proposal A and Proposal B. Proposal A is dealing with our involvement in China. We'll get out of China. We'll recognize China as an independent state, but we would like to keep Manchuria and keep our current holdings and become a trade partner with the US again. Option B is we'll get out of Indochina and limit our and cease our active hostilities in China. They liked Proposal B better because it was less centered on the quagmire that was China. They didn't want to have to deal with China any more than they had to at this point. So that's kind of what Nomura is talking about here. Is he's being given this ultimatum to give to the U.S. and he kind of senses that I don't know what's going on, but I think we're starting to see the end of diplomatic negotiation. We see that Cordell Hull is talking with a couple other members of his staff and the Secretary of War Stimson. He mentions that we've been given these points. They're sending another ambassador. This other ambassador is Kurusu. This is where I was mixed up. My apologies. On November 5th, Kurusu would leave Japan with those proposals from the November 1st meeting. By the 14th, the United States would decline both peace proposals. They did not like the terms. They would eventually deliver their own set of conditions called the Hull Note, basically the diplomatic back and forth. But unfortunately, the Hull Note was delivered to Japan on the 26th of November. The decision had already been made at the previous November 1st meeting that the deadline for a diplomatic solution between the United States and Japan would be December the 1st. The Japanese fleet is already setting sail as of the time the Hull Note is given to Japan.
Oh.
And we see in the next scene, this is a very important scene. Yamamoto is addressing his officers. I love this scene because it is a man who understands the situation better. Not to say everyone in this room is stupid, but he has firsthand knowledge of the American people. He understands a lot, like I'm saying, there's a lot of nuance to the situation. He understands more of that nuance as opposed to the Japanese officers and enlisted men who are fight for the glory of the empire, are we want to better our empire, and the Americans and other Western powers are keeping us from doing that. Yamamoto doesn't necessarily not believe that, but he appreciates that it's not black and white, right? And he tries to explain that to his officers. And I love that he says, look, we're sailing to attack Pearl Harbor. Diplomatic negotiations between our nation and the United States are ending between now and the time we launch our attack. If a diplomatic solution is found, we will turn around and go home. And that shocks all his officers because that would be dishonorable. That would be an affront to the emperor. That would be betraying the months and months of training and practice the men have put in. And Yamamoto has this wonderful scene, and props to his actor, Yamamura. So Yamamura, he delivers this really great. He really well done. He says, if you're going to reject an order to return, resign now and get off my fleet. The American people, you have been led to believe that the American people are spiritually lacking and these, decadent, secular people with no honor. I have been among them. They are determined. They are hardworking. They are stout in their beliefs. They are good people. If there is an opportunity to not put our nation at war with them, we should and will take it. And again, I appreciate that they let the Japanese film crew show this side of Yamamoto, because this is not this is not untrue. He not grew up in America. He was educated partially in America. He served a tour of duty as a naval attaché in America. He is in a position to make this argument. He says the Americans are a proud and just people. It's that Sun Tzu art of war. Know your enemy, right? Yamamoto knows the Americans, and he knows that yes, he will fight the fight that his country asks him to fight, but he also knows there is great risk in doing that. And I love that scene for it. So fabulous. Ethan, your thoughts. I please, what are you thinking up to now? Because I realize I am getting into that World War II talk without stopping mode. So
It is
please.
so rare. I'd even go so far as to call it spectacular to see someone who is not just, one-dimensional bad guy. Yeah, I
I
guess,
I
you
would
know,
argue this movie doesn't have a bad guy. I know
yeah,
that's weird to say. And again, that's not a Japanese were totally justified. No, that's not what I'm saying. They do such a good job at just telling the facts. There's not a good guy narrative. There's not a bad guy narrative. In a lot of sense, I read something about this. This is a war movie that if you watch it from the American side, it's about a tragedy, a loss. And if you watch it from the Japanese side, it's about a victory. Like it's not this good versus evil movie. It is just a telling of historical events, and I love that.
yeah, and that's exactly what I'm driving at. I mean, it feels so unbiased. So I just the long shot where he's addressing his fleet and just the sea of stone-faced men hearing what he has to say. America would be the most formidable foe we've ever thought. It's
That is a
just
great. America will be the most formidable foe. He's not saying we, the men in that room, we, the nation and empire of Japan, has ever fought. It is so good. I love it so much.
absolutely, oh, 10 out of
And then
10.
we get the scene where you lost your goddamn mind for a second.
Oh yeah,
Colonel Bratton is getting all these magic intercepts as the Japanese fleet is starting to make the move. Because you have to remember, Pearl Harbor was not a single incident. Pearl Harbor, the attack on the Philippines, the attack on Singapore, the attack on Wake Island, Burma, all these attacks were simultaneous to within about a day of each other. Wake would fall, I think, by December 12th. There's a really good. I'll try to remember to put a video in the description about if you want to watch a little bit about the siege of Wake Island. But a bunch of pieces of the Japanese military all started moving at once, and obviously they noticed that. They see that a large fleet is heading south, a transport fleet with escorts, big military convoy heading south. And Colonel Rufus Barton, has that moment where he goes, we got a communique saying that their deadline for diplomatic negotiations is November 30th, which is correct because of the international dateline. December 1st in Japan, November 30th, international dateline. Which there's a scene where two Japanese ship's cooks really lay that out for us. It's really fun. Side note, I just remember this. We're watching the extended edition. We're watching the edition with some extra little scenes added in. So if I mention a scene that you don't remember seeing, that's why. He puts the pieces together and goes, the Japanese are moving their fleet. They're cutting off diplomatic ties on the 30th. The 30th is a Sunday. The 30th is a Sunday. My God, we're going to be attacked Sunday, the 30th of November. And he assumes they're going to be attacking Guam or the Philippines, or they're going to attack the British in Singapore. And he's like, holy shit, I figured it out. Someone has all the pieces of information and put them together. But just not quite. Again, this concept of there's no way the Japanese could sail across the entire Pacific and bomb Pearl Harbor. His immediate thought is they're sailing south. They're going to attack one of the colonies down there, the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, something. And he's not wrong. but he's missing a really big part of it. And it just, Ethan, when this happened and I heard you on the other end just going like, oh my God. Like, and it's
I
about here, that the movie starts getting really stressful. And I compared it to the first episode of the miniseries Chernobyl, where it's like, we know what's going to happen. And just watching how close it was to not happening or happening a little less worse is just. But yeah, your thoughts at this point, Ethan.
Oh, yeah, it's that sense of impending doom, it's trying to tell the young blonde camp counselor in the movie that the axe wielding maniac is just behind that door. You moron, don't do it, don't do it. And then she does it anyway, and there's nothing you can do except this had genuine and long lasting and real repercussions on our society and world as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So he brings that information to the war cabinet, essentially, the Secretary of State, some of the Joint Chiefs. I don't think they're called the Joint Chiefs of Staff at this point, but essentially some of the top generals of the Army and the Navy and the admirals of the Navy. They discuss it. They say the facts are undeniable. We think you're relatively correct. We'll keep, we're going to let the president know, and we're going to try to deal with this. This is where I think this is an extra scene, so I'm going to point it out. There's this really nice scene of Yamamoto being taken to the Imperial Palace to essentially do a ceremony. It's not even, it's very much I say that it's kind of kabuki theater. It's the head of the Navy is going to formally tell the Emperor that his fleet is ready for this attack. We are ready to go to war. And the Emperor is going to give his blessing. And it's this formal, I, as the Emperor, give you my military permission to follow through on this attack we've been planning. But the head of, essentially, the White House chief of staff of the Emperor, the head of his household, his personal valet, chief of staff, whatever you want to call him, is talking to Yamamoto like, here's how it's going to go. You're going to walk in. I can't go in past here. This is a formal thing. It's very ceremonial. It's a formality. I am so, and he says something. I want to get the exact quote off the subtitles because it's very sad. Give me a second here to get it. He says his mastery will ask the customary questions. You're to give the traditional customary replies. And then he says there can be no more tragic ritual than this conversation. Between His Majesty, who does not want war, and your Excellency, who has opposed it so vigorously. As Minister of the Imperial Household, I'm not allowed to attend this ritual. Fortunately for me, I won't have to witness this tragic ceremony.
Oh, no.
It's the people in the know. There are people in Japan who really are like, we know this is not a good idea. But based on everything we've talked about for the last hour and a half, it couldn't have gone any different. Like, so, it laid out this way over a century. And again, it fascinates me.
This is kind of where I want to take a beat and make you do some off-the-cuff research.
Okay.
How in the world, through the history that we've discussed previously, how did the Emperor achieve such a godlike deity status? And I understand it's a culture of respect and honor, but this is way beyond that. It's mind-boggling to me.
This is a very big question, and I am not knowledgeable enough about ancient or medieval Japanese history to really answer it. The Emperor is the literal incarnation of God on Earth. He, even more so than, say, the medieval kings of Europe, right? Like Emperor Charlemagne. Even more to a higher degree than that. he is not he is not wearing a crown that gives him the authority to rule by God. He, by his very birth and existence, is given the godlike power. He is part God, essentially.
Oh,
Yeah,
that would do it.
And again, big like blimp size asterisks. I am not knowledgeable enough about ancient Japanese history or the Shinto culture or any of that to speak any further than that. But he is almost a deity. To the point that when the Americans were occupying Japan after the war, it was very early on determined that you must maintain the emperor as the head of government, or everything is going to go to absolute hell in a handbasket.
My God.
The right of the emperor to rule, not rule, but exist as a part of Japanese culture has to be there, or Japan is not gonna be on board with anything that you try to do as an occupying force, which was very different to how say Germany was handled after World War II. But yeah, it's fascinating, and I am not qualified to. That is the one thing that you could ask me that I'm like, I am not qualified to speak on it further. But because that's not that's like if I get the name of a gun wrong or the date of an attack wrong, man, I'm an idiot. I am not about to get the facts wrong about a culture's emperor. Like that is such a unique and interesting bit of history that I don't feel I'm qualified to speak on. Because the imperial family still exists.
Right.
Like I don't know if you know, like Emperor Hirohito was alive up into the 80s, I think, like late 80s. Like him and Ronald Reagan have met. Like,
oh, don't. Oh,
yeah. Don't. I will pull up a picture right now.
So I did a little bit of very cursory research, and I'd like to follow up your blimp asterisk by also saying I'm a moron, and this is just scratching the surface and not even doing that. But the emperor was considered a direct descendant of the sun goddess in the Shinto religion, so it was a continuation of a lineage there, which explains a lot. I hate that photo. Oh my God. Oh, I know the bottom photo. The top one is, and I hope
Actually, Hirohito, I believe, is the oldest was the oldest living head of state from the Second World War, because Churchill died, Roosevelt died, Truman died, Hitler died, Stalin died, and Charles de Gaulle died. So he was, I believe, the oldest living head of state from any of the World War II major powers.
We gotta move.
Not counting the Prince of, I want to say it's Prince of Hungary, who was like 11 when Germany invaded Hungary and overthrew the government. So technically, and he was technically the crown prince. He was head of the government, but because he was 11, the government was being run by the parliament. Right. So technically, this 11-year-old kid who grew up, who like survived into like the late 90s, early 2000s, I believe, was technically the last World War II head of state. But yeah. So yeah. He for reference, Hirohito passed away on January 7th, 89.
All right, we need to move on. My head's hurting.
Anyway. So yeah. So we see that as Yamamoto goes to meet with the Emperor, the Japanese fleet is sailing through the North Pacific, and we get those ever-famous words, the code phrase that says, "You have passed the point of no return, continue with your attack." December 2nd, climb Mount Nitaka. That was the Japanese code phrase for Diplomatic relations have been cut off. The Emperor has given you permission to attack Pearl Harbor. There is no going back now.
Ugh.
Because of the fear that the Japanese fleet is on the move toward the South Pacific, there are a squadron of Japanese carriers that are missing. The entire Pacific Command is put on a war warning. Again, this is one of those things that's like, what the hell does that mean? And you see the General Short and Admiral Kimmel react to it, and they're like, the fuck? My troops are confused. I don't know what this means. Put them on alert again, I guess, and I guess we'll wait and see what happens. Admiral Kimmel orders Halsey and the other admirals of the carrier fleet to go out and probe some more, take some reinforcements of aircraft to Wake Island and Midway Island. And while you're out there, keep your eyes open. And Halsey has this great interaction with Kimmel, where he essentially asks, "What if I encounter the Japanese? What the hell am I supposed to do?" And Kimmel gives the order, "Use your common sense." And I love that Halsey's like, "That's the best order I've had, because if I see so much as a sampan, I'm gonna blow it to Kingdom Come." So, but this gives us the answer of where were the carriers, the carrier fleet during Pearl Harbor. They were only a couple hundred miles away, doing an Eastern patrol and delivering squadrons of aircraft to Wake Island and Midway. In fact, we'll see later at the end of the movie that Halsey's carrier, the Enterprise, I believe his is the Enterprise and the others is the Lexington, comes back into port, and they rearm and refit and immediately get the hell back out of port because they don't know if there's going to be an invasion, another attack, and they don't want the carriers stuck in harbor. Because America was so paranoid, they didn't know what was going to happen next. The Enterprise and a small task force was supposed to go reinforce Wake Island, but they got called back to Hawaii because they thought that Wake Island was just getting attacked as a diversion, and they were going to invade Hawaii. So they basically... Wake Island's a hard one to learn about because the Marines put up a fucking hell of a defense. And actually, I believe they sank a Japanese destroyer with their 5-inch shore battery. But the American Navy they were half their fleet size all of a sudden, with no reinforcements and not enough manpower. They had to decide when and where they were going to attack or have a fight with the Japanese Navy, and Wake Island was not it. The American fleet could not risk engaging the Japanese full strength of the Japanese Navy that soon. So they kind of let Wake Island die on the vine, sadly. But unfortunately, those are the decisions you have to make, and it would ultimately turn out for the better because the American fleet would turn around to launch a bombing attack on Japan, and the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, which were big turning points. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Yeah, so essentially the American carriers are out of port because Kimmel sent Halsey and the other admirals to go reinforce their outer defenses at Wake and do some, as they say, probing. And they also make the decision not to send the battleships out because they don't want to risk the battleships going out and encountering an enemy fleet or an enemy patrol or a submarine force without without the cover of the carriers. So they figured that the battle wagons, as they call them, would be safer in port for the time being, which at the time made sense. But anyway, Ethan, you just sent a very interesting image in the that we're not going to elaborate why you're laughing about it, but they get we see that the Japanese side note, Admiral Nagumo, the older gentleman you see on the carrier command deck, Admiral Nagumo would be the admiral who would be in charge of the Japanese carrier fleet for most of the beginning of the war, and would actually be in charge of the fleet at the Battle of Midway. just for reference.
Huh.
But we see that they're getting the latest reports from Hawaii. Again, as we mentioned earlier, this is from Ensign Yoshikawa under diplomatic cover. He was giving reports up to the day before the attack, so that the fleet could have the most up-to-date information. He also didn't know why. He knew that war was coming, and he assumed that they just needed. He didn't know Pearl Harbor was necessarily being attacked. He just knew that the Japanese Navy and the Japanese government needed this information. But we then get, you sent this picture. So what did you want to say something about this scene? This I believe this is another extended edition scene where you have the two Japanese cooks discussing the international dateline.
This scene is pretty much exactly how I feel right about now. You're not too intelligent, but I'll try to explain.
Oh no, is this us? Is this us right now?
Yeah, this is us. So listen
no.
carefully. A little before
this is one
1300 hours, right? Go ahead.
This is one of those scenes. There's a couple of them, like the monkey with the 10-cent balloon. There's one right as the attack starts. It's like they inserted tiny little moments of levity. And this is one of them where the two sailors are trying to work out how the international dateline works. And I love the younger of the two, the assistant, it looks like. He says, well, if we see an enemy across the international dateline, there's no point in shooting at them. It's like, wait, why? Well, how can today's shells hit yesterday's enemy? Very mash moment of this. But anyway.
Oh, and then the fateful. Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm glad we got that moment of levity.
So this is where my notes start getting very fast. December 3rd. The U.S. knows the Japanese fleet is on the move. A friend of Franklin Roosevelt's who was part of a diplomatic mission to Japan in the decade previous comes into his office. Ambassadors Caruso and Nomura worked this out with Stanley Jones. He went to Franklin Roosevelt and offered to work with the Japanese ambassadors to have President Roosevelt send a telegram with an offer to discuss and negotiate directly to Emperor Hirohito. This was on December 3rd, one day after the go-no-go decision for Pearl Harbor. He would not send a telegram that day, but would rather wait and send it the evening of December the 6th. As the Japanese were getting into their launch position for their aircraft. So yeah, there's that. And also on December 3rd, an unusual amount of smoke is spotted at the Japanese embassy. This that we are seeing now in the movie, we're back in the magic intercept room. They are receiving what is called the 14 points message. On December 4th, Japan drafted the final 14 points of their decision to break off negotiations with the United States, with instructions that the 14th point not be delivered until a few hours before the attack.
Oh.
In order for this to happen, basically on December the 4th, they're intercepting an instruction to the ambassadors saying, tomorrow we're going to send you a long list of conditions that you're going to give to the U.S. Be ready to translate them. Be ready to decode them, because you're going to need to deliver them by a deadline. Here is something the movie doesn't cover. On the night of the 6th, as it's the 5th into the 6th, this whole thing.
Right.
That weekend, that Friday, there was a selection of diplomats at the Japanese embassy who were going to be retiring and rotating out. So they had a farewell party for them, complete with sake and ping pong tournaments. The secretary responsible for reading through and preparing these documents got pulled into a ping pong tournament. History does not tell us if he won or not. But by the next morning, a lot of the staff was hungover, and it was also a Sunday, so a lot of them weren't around. So by the time the Japanese embassy had to start decoding these transmissions, they had to pull what staff they could get. Unfortunately, a typist was not among them. So the Japanese, as we go into this next couple scenes, as they're trying, the movie doesn't cover this super well. You get the impression based on the shots they give us. The Japanese are frantically trying to translate this to get it in front of Secretary Hull by the appointed time. But there's a whole lot more happening in the background that the movie doesn't show. But it's chaos. So Colonel Barton and Admiral I keep forgetting this admiral's name. Lieutenant Commander Kramer realize something's about to happen. What we don't know. We don't know what's about to happen, but this is sending up a bunch of red flags. Kramer gets the first 13 points of the breaking off of the diplomatic negotiations, and by reading the first 13 points, he sees, oh shoot, this is the prelude to maybe not an immediate attack, but war. We'll be at war with Japan in the next week because they're closing off diplomatic ties. They've been instructed to burn code books, destroy cipher machines. We'll be at war a week from now. That is a very big deal. Big concern. So we see over the next several minutes that Commander Kramer is going to be being driven around Washington by his wife, trying to get this information to as many. This is the night of December 6th, trying to alert as many members of the government and military to try to figure out, how do we respond to this? Do we put people on alert? Do we not put people on alert? What's going on? And the movie does an okay job of showing this, but in reality, Washington is scattering. Like, the movie doesn't quite do a good enough job to show how many people were running around trying to get an answer to this problem at 1:00 in the morning, Washington time. But we see that the Japanese are making their final preparations, and this was the scene where I'm like, they're really doing a good job showing us an unbiased view of both sides. Because of course the Japanese aviators would be excited and pumped.
Yeah.
But like, they're practicing bombing the battleships in Battleship Row. They're practicing ship identification. And again, another moment of levity that I always laugh at this movie. They're doing ship identification, identifying a ship or an aircraft by its silhouette, which was very important. They're holding up a picture of battleship. Pennsylvania. Okay, this one, Oklahoma. And they hold up a carrier. He goes, the Lexington. And it's like, no, you idiot. That's the ship you're on. That's your flagship. And they all give him shit for it. It's so great. Like, I love that they take the moment to show. Again, I don't like that Pearl Harbor was attacked. That's not good. But I appreciate that the movie took the time to be like, the Japanese have been working toward this and they're pumped. And showing that, I think, is the right thing, especially in the context of this movie being a historical retelling. We still have, this is all just buildup. This is the ramping up of the tension. You see the Japanese are strapping bombs to planes, getting into final position. Meanwhile, in Washington, there's maybe a handful of people running around dealing with it unknowingly, and everyone else is just kind of unsure of what to do. And it's, again, that's that for a movie that's not an action movie, this stresses me out.
It's excellent tension building.
For an event we already know the outcome of.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so masterfully done.
So as this continues, we start getting into the wee hours of December the 7th. The Apana Point radar guys are told they have to report at 4 a.m. because their radar station has to operate, but only for 3 hours. The Japanese fleet is making their final flight preparations. They're getting into their launch point. The Japanese sailors are addressed by Admiral Nagumo. They give a rousing cheer of banzai, and we are into Sunday morning, December the 7th. The magic decipher room gets the final point part of the message instructing the Japanese to destroy all their code books and to deliver the address to the 14th point to the United States government at precisely 1 p.m., which is 8 a.m. Hawaiian time. Immediately red flags go off because why is there a deadline? Why is there such a specific deadline? This starts setting off alarm bells. The ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, raises inquiry with the Japanese government of what the heck's going on. But also delivers Roosevelt's message that I mentioned of the evening of December 6th, wanting to have a direct communication between him and the emperor. And Kanoye and Tojo talk about this. I believe that's Kanoye. Kanoye? That's not Kanoye. I'm sorry, that's a different. Again, lots of characters in the movie. Hard to keep track of all of them. The proposal was for just a heart-to-heart exchange between the heads of government and Tojo. Again, really good job of this. I like how they don't show Tojo as like the stereotypical Tojo from the propaganda of, fight the Americans, blah, blah, blah. He stops for a second, thinks about it, and goes, it's too late. If it had come 2 days before, maybe, but no, too late. Literally, the planes are warming up on the carriers right now. There's no get out of here.
Oh,
yep. And then the final. I got a little ahead of myself. The final nail in the coffin that Barton panics about is not just the deadline, the 14th point deadline of 1 p.m. They get the final communique from the Japanese government to the ambassadors saying, once you have delivered your message, go back and destroy everything. And that's the moment where Barton's like, we're being attacked today. Shit, we're being attacked today at 1 p.m. Shit. And he runs out of the room and tries to go get the message out. You have to remember, no internet. A lot of stuff has to be done in person, especially if it's top secret, right?
Yeah.
So he tries to reach his commander, General of the Army, George Marshall. Can't get him. It's Sunday morning. He's out riding his horse. No one's in their offices at the Ministry of War. You're seeing them run around. You see the Japanese delegates, Kurusu and Nomura, reading through and being like, they're just now realizing at 11 a.m. we need to have a meeting with the Secretary of State for the United States in 2 hours on a Sunday. And we have to have this translated and officially typed up with no errors, no, mistypings, and ready to present as a formal, essentially declaration of war in 2 hours. Oh, fuck. Oh, shit. Oh, fuck. Oh, shit. Like, you see everyone start, again, ramping that tension, ramping that with nothing scary. There's no explosions yet. It's just the sense of impending doom us, the audience, have knowing what's about to happen. And it's a lot like, this is going to be a really dumb movie to compare it to, especially since I hate the Michael Bay Pearl Harbor movie because it's a historical movie with a love story in it.
But
Titanic. Titanic is a great movie. It's got its problems, but I think it's a great movie. And despite knowing the ship sinks, it still captivates me. Despite knowing that Pearl Harbor is going to be attacked, there is a part of me hoping someone figures it the fuck out, right? Like, the movie does such a good job of it. We see another meeting between Stimson, the admirals, some generals, basically saying, okay, the Japanese have a fleet heading south towards some of our holdings, some of our allies' holdings. The Japanese have an ultimatum that they've given to us that needs to be, the final part of it is delivered exactly at 1 p.m., no sooner, no later. and the Japanese embassy has been ordered to destroy all of its code books, ciphers, all that. This is a meeting with Admiral Stark, Chief of Naval Operations. And everyone in the room is in agreement. Japan's about to attack something in 2 hours. We don't know what, but it's something in the Pacific. And the very first thing that is recommended to do is, do you think you should call the Chief of the Pacific Fleet Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii? And it's at this moment, another time, where I feel Ethan going, for fuck's sake!
It's such good suspense build. He picks up the phone. He picks it up and he stops. No, better call the president first. And
Which is not wrong. He's not. It's not malicious. The American military wasn't incompetent, in my opinion. It's just he had a choice. He could act without asking the president, and he wouldn't get in trouble for it. But he said, no, I'm going to confirm with my commander-in-chief what he wants to do first. That's not a bad decision, but oh my God, in hindsight, what the most wrong decision.
Yeah, absolutely. He did it right on paper, but holy fuck. Oh.
And again, I'm sure there are parts of this that are slightly dramatized. Like, did he really pick up the phone and hold it there for a second, then put it down? Or was it, he said later, I considered calling Kimmel, but wanted to talk to the president, and they played it up? Ultimately, for me, it doesn't matter. Because the facts are still the facts that he thought, if he thought about it, this is the movie thing of show, don't tell. They can't tell us, they can't give us his inner monologue, so they have to show us what he's thinking. But even then, it's still so good.
I give this movie a lot of leeway for dramatic effects, because it's still factually correct. If it hams it up a little bit, okay, so it's a damn good movie.
And then the zoom in on the notepad with the date and the clock in the corner right before intermission is just chef's kiss.
Can you imagine
being in the theater?
Yeah. And the intermission pops up. Oh my God. What I wouldn't give to be in a movie theater lobby in 1970 when this was playing to a crowd, just to hear what they were thinking.
We come back from the intermission, and this has gone from a war drama to a war action movie. And it happens, if the intermission weren't there, it would happen so naturally. The music is slowly ramping up. You get basically a almost 10-minute or 8-minute uninterrupted scene of just Japan getting the carriers ready. This was a little bit earlier, but they were praying to their Shinto shrine. Some of them were praying very formally, some very informally. It was just, again, chef's kiss, well done. You see them getting the planes ready. You see that they're in good spirits. They're raring to go. And again, I said this while we were watching the movie. One of my favorite tropes in war movies: music ramps up, music ramps up, music ramps up, music cuts, engine starts, or artillery starts firing, or something to that effect. Oh God, I love it. They turn the ship into the wind. They begin launching the aircraft. And we get like 4 minutes uninterrupted of just aircraft launching off an aircraft carrier. And for me, I love it because you get the sense of just how much force is coming down on Hawaii right now. Like, if we watch 1 or 2 planes take off and then cut, it's like, okay, cool, they're launching planes. But watching one after another, after another, after another, after another, and seeing the formations fly by the carrier, and seeing more and more and more planes, it's like, holy crap. Oh boy. Everything we've been watching for the last hour is finally coming to a head. And I love it. It's so good. So as the carriers aircraft are taking off, we get the last moments of that people trying to figure out what's going on in Washington. They're starting to read and translate the points of the Japanese ultimatum. And here's another thing. here is part of the problem with the ramp up to this and the American distrust of the Japanese ambassadors. Japanese diplomatic communications were written in formal Japanese.
Okay.
They were translated in simple Japanese, which changed some of the meanings of the words, and the American translators
Oh.
were shorthanding some of it. So something like we as a nation are no longer able to basically there's that you can look at comparisons online of the wording of the document translated from formal Japanese and how it was actually translated, and things like the the Japanese offer these final the Japanese government would like to offer these final options for the US got translated to something like the Japanese government is making an ultimatum. Like these subtle changes of like we want to try to continue to work with you versus this is your last chance before we kick your ass. Like
Yeah, yeah.
that certainly did not help matters. Um so George Marshall, Chief of Staff for the Army, agrees to send out an alert to all Pacific stations. He gives it to Colonel Barton. We flash back to Pearl Harbor. The first shots of World War II, arguably. The USS Destroyer Ward patrolling the mouth of the harbor spots a conning tower of a submarine trying to sneak behind a ship into the harbor. The events on screen are basically 100% accurate. The Destroyer Ward would fire 2 shells from its forward battery, 1 miss, 1 hit center of the conning tower, and then would roll a few depth charges and radio that they have shelled and depth charge a submarine. It was not confirmed if they sunk the submarine and destroyed it until many decades later when the midget sub was actually found off the coast of Hawaii, just
Well,
outside the
so
harbor entrance.
and that's kind of something I wanted to ask you because my knowledge going into this was subpar, but uh, submarines, midget sub or no, it was kind of a surprise to me to see.
So the
It,
Japanese attempt. So in addition to the aerial attack, there was uh, a secondary plan to have 5 midget submarines infiltrate the harbor.
oh gosh.
This is one of those like it's not a conspiracy theory, but what ifs of Pearl Harbor that it's I have to re-research it because it's been so long since I've looked into it. I don't know what the consensus is today about it. All 5 midget subs were reported sunk. The first Japanese prisoner of war was one of the midget submarine sailors who washed up on shore of one of the Hawaiian Islands.
Wow.
There is arguable evidence that a submarine made it into the harbor. These are some old History Channel documentaries, and I don't know how much trust I put in them. But essentially, in some of the attack photos, there's evidence that maybe a submarine was in the harbor making torpedo attacks.
Wow.
I know one of the big theories is going back to what we discussed earlier. When you drop a torpedo, it submerges and runs under the water, right?
Yeah.
So its propellers should not be hitting the surface of the water and creating what are called rooster tails, right?
Right.
There are photos during the attack of very clearly something underneath the water that is close enough to the surface that the wave action is kicking its propulsion system toward the surface and creating these little rooster fantails behind it. That is one of the pieces of evidence people say the only thing that would be floating that close to the surface with enough power to make a rooster tail that big would be a midget submarine. So they
Oh.
argue that the midgets, and there's further pictures that from where the rooster tails are, you can see a torpedo track. Like there's a whole bunch of theories, and I haven't watched anything on it or researched anything on it recently enough to say with any certainty. But yeah, the Japanese Navy sent midget submarines that were parasited onto a mother sub and ferried within a couple like I want to say it was like 100 miles. I want to say of or closer than that probably. But yeah, the Japanese were going to try to infiltrate the harbor with midget subs as well.
My lord.
So yeah,
Well,
fun
cool.
times.
But
Little
they
two-man
sunk
midget
one.
subs.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Ward is, for the most part, credited with the first shots that America fired in the Second World. Well, first shots that America fired in the Second World War, asterisk mark, we had the Flying Tigers in China that were technically not American airmen, but they were volunteers who went over of their own accord. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Wink, wink. They were there voluntarily. Wink, wink.
Yeah.
So that gets radioed in and ignored. Damn, that's crazy. Anyway,
Imagine my shock.
I love, and again, this is going to sound weird to say in hindsight. I love that they gave us a scene. This is very much Japanese war movie imagery right here, and this is why I'm so glad they let a Japanese team film the Japanese side of stuff. You get this kind of cool scene of as the Japanese flight is heading south toward Pearl Harbor. You get the sun rising through the clouds, creating the rays, and they comment, "It looks like the flag of our nation." And I'm like, dang, that's kind of a cool scene. Like,
Yeah.
despite the fact these guys are about to bomb the shit out of the U.S. Navy, that's kind of a cool little thing to put in there. Because imagine being a Japanese aviator on your first attack mission. You've been hyped up for a year almost. And the first thing you see when you're up in the air to go do this for your emperor is the literal rising sun of your empire. Like, that's the equivalent of riding into battle and hearing America. You know, like
Yeah.
again, it's this shots like this and moments like this. I'm so glad they let a Japanese film crew do the Japanese scenes, because if an American team tried to do this, it would probably come off weird. It's done in just the right way. And I know I said I wasn't going to try to point out every single actor in this movie. I love the actor who plays Flight Commander Fuchida. His little smirks and his little mannerisms as Fuchida are so good.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, I believe that is, let me get his name. Yeah, Takahiro Tamura. A Japanese actor, Takahiro Tamura. So it's happening. We're just about here where this is gonna. Don't worry. Once the attack starts, the amount of talking I'm gonna do is gonna decrease significantly, listener. We see that as the planes are approaching Hawaii, the Japanese typist is still hunting, pecking his way through the 14 points. We see that the Colonel Bratton is ready to send General Marshall's alert out to the Pacific Fleet, but the colonel in the communications office can't read the general's handwriting, so it's going to be a little bit delayed. We see that the Honolulu radio was kept on all night to help a flight of B-17s make it to the islands. Guess who else is trying to make it to the islands? Like, just all these little things. Again, the tension is ramping. The Opana Point radar detects a big fleet of aircraft coming in. They have a phone, they call it in and get told, "Don't worry about it," and they shut down and go home. Just so many opportunities. And the sad thing is, each time there's an opportunity to potentially do something, your ability to do something is less, right? Like 6 months ago, when 6 months ago you could have prepared the fleet for an attack. Okay, 6 weeks ago you could have prepared. Okay, 6 days ago maybe not so much, but you can get the carriers out of port and put the island on alert. 6 hours before, okay, you can get combat air patrols up in the air. 6 minutes before, you can sound general quarters, but literally no one put the pieces together until the last possible moment when you couldn't have done anything. And it's just, again, why Pearl Harbor fascinates me so much. It's just how how well the Japanese planned and just how everything happened the right way. And again, I don't think it's because the American government was incompetent. It just, the chips fell where they did. We see that Nomura and Karusu are going to be late to their meeting with Secretary of State Hull.
I'm sure
Kimmel,
that could have no negative
that's
repercussions
not going to have
whatsoever.
any negative repercussions. Kimmel is furious he was not informed that the ward fired on a potential hostile vessel right outside the harbor entrance. The telegrams and alerts are sent from Washington to the Far East commands. Hawaii cannot be reached because this is something that maybe people don't realize. Back then, they used ultra high frequency radio waves. I can't. It's I think UHF. Yeah, UHF is long range. I forget. It's been a while since I did any ham radio study. But essentially, for long distance communications, you're using radio waves that are bouncing off the upper atmosphere and kind of bouncing around the Earth that way. And if you're trying to communicate with somewhere and there's bad weather in the wrong spot between you and that target, the signal won't bounce correctly and will not get to where you want it to go. Unfortunately, guess who had bad atmospheric conditions to receive instantaneous long wave communications? Hawaii. So they sent it by Western Union telegram, and they forgot to mark the telegram urgent. So it sat for 3 to 4 hours in the Western Union office in Honolulu as the attack was happening. Yep. And again, it's not any one person's fault. It's just the way it happened. We then get to, I am so happy. I know I'm going to, listener, you're about to roll your eyes. We got to a part where I was so happy I could go on a rabbit hole search for, as if I haven't been doing that for the last hour and a half. So, as the Japanese formations approach Oahu, they encounter a civilian aircraft. This is a real thing that happened. The movie dramatizes it a little bit, but this is a real thing that happened. So if I may, for a moment, before we get into the action, can I tell you, Ethan and listener, about Cornelia Fort?
I would be offended if you didn't.
So in this scene, we see that a flight instructor and her student are up in the air and encounter the Japanese formation, and they're kind of flying with them for a minute, and then she takes the plane out and away. This is a very simple dramatization of what actually happened. What happened is Cornelia Fort was an aviator who became famous for being part of 2 aviation-related events in U.S. history. Her first was while working as a civilian pilot in Pearl Harbor. She inadvertently became the first witness to the Japanese attack. She was up in the air with a student pilot practicing takeoffs and landings at a local civilian airfield. Her airplane and a few others were the only U.S. planes in the air near the harbor. Fort saw military airplanes flying directly toward her and swiftly grabbed the controls from her student to pull up over the oncoming craft. While she was pulling up over it, she noticed the rising sun insignia on the wings, and within moments she saw billows of black smoke coming from Pearl Harbor. She quickly landed the plane at the civilian airfield near the mouth of Pearl Harbor, and pursuing Zero fighters strafed her plane and the runway as she and her student ran for cover. During the attack, the airport manager was killed along with 2 other civilian planes that did not return that morning. So before I go any further, I want to point this out because the Pearl Harbor movie by Michael Bay does this, and I want to be very careful. I know I just read to you that the Japanese shot a civilian airfield and civilian aircraft. That's not good. That is bad. That is a war crime. However, in the heat of the attack, when your targets are enemy airfields, enemy aircraft on the ground, in the air, whatever, I can understand target misidentification. What did not happen is that the Japanese did not intentionally, purposely strafe civilian center. You see this in the Michael Bay movie where the Japanese are just strafing hospitals and not babies, but you know what I mean. They're strafing everything. No. The Japanese were focused on the harbor. Yes, some civilian installations and people were hurt, injured, and killed. More civilians died of, I believe, of anti-aircraft shells not being set right in the initial volleys of defensive fire and landing in civilian areas than the Japanese killed, arguably. So I want it pointed out that yes, civilians were injured and killed at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese did not intentionally target civilian population centers in the attack. I think that's a really shitty thing that the Michael Bay movie did. It's frustrating, and I just wanted to point that out. Anyway,
what I'm really taking from this is not only is the events of that scene accurate, they are in fact watered down from the original story.
But wait, there's more.
How?
With all civilian flights grounded in Hawaii because the islands would go under martial law immediately after the attack and would not be lifted until the end of the war, Fort returned to mainland United States in early 1942. She made a short movie promoting war bonds about her story, which led to several speaking engagements. Later that year, a woman named Nancy Love recruited her to serve in the newly established Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, which was the precursor to the WASPs, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. What do you know about the Women Air Force Service Pilots, Ethan? Or do you know anything about them?
I am familiar with the term, and that is all.
So living in the Midwest, you might be aware of this. Are you aware of all the random little World War II era Army airfields that are dotted all over the place that are abandoned now?
Constantly reminded and constantly want to go explore them, but constantly shot at by angry farmers.
Yes. There's one I plan to visit legally for a geocache when I come out to visit you in Walker.
Whoop, whoop.
The reason those are all over the place is because America was producing planes during the war, right? And they had to get ferried to either the West Coast or the East Coast to get shipped out to the battlefront. Well, if you were a adult male capable of piloting a plane, your ass certainly wasn't at home flying planes. You were flying bombers or fighters or patrol aircraft in the war. So women aviators were the primary people ferrying these planes. A corps of thousands of women were flying the planes from factories to airfields on the coasts to get them to the troops. It's very much in the vein of like the Rosie the Riveter of the home front of World War II is fascinating. I don't think our generation can understand, and this is what I say when people are like, times are hard in America, we're, constantly involved in foreign politics. I'm like, yes, that's true. You and I aren't going down to the town square with the tires off our cars and our iPhone batteries so the military can strip the rubber and lithium from them for the war effort. Like, we are...
Year's not over yet.
It's true. We are so not mentally aware of how much that generation... And there's a whole bunch... I could talk on this for hours. I would argue World War II was the last truly justified war for moral reasons. You had Germany doing evil things. You had Japan conquering things. You could argue that that was a moral war. And I think it was for a lot of reasons. The sacrifices that people made to fight what they were being told was evil at that time, remarkable. Like, ridiculous. Like, hey, you're not allowed to buy gas this month. Piss off. Like, that's literally a thing. Like, it's just crazy. But yeah, she was part of the Women's Air Service ferrying planes throughout the country so they could get to the battlefront. It just incredible.
Good God. And I mean, shit. Yeah, talk about grueling to just be flying planes nonstop for months at a time for the war effort. I mean, that was multiple days without sleep.
She was the second woman accepted into the service. the second
That's
woman into the
awesome.
Women's Air Service.
That is so cool.
While stationed at the 6th Ferrying Group base at Long Beach, California, Cornelia Fort would unfortunately also earn the title of the first Women's Air Ferry Service fatality.
Oh, fuck. What do you
On March
mean?
on March 21st, 1943, while flying in formation en route from Long Beach to Love Field in Dallas, her left wing of her BT-13 was struck by the landing gear of Flight Officer Frank Stame Jr.'s plane. Stame had been flying too close to Fort's plane, approaching her and then pulling back. On one of those close passes, the collision took place, breaking off the tip of her wing and 6 feet of the leading edge.
Holy
He
fuck.
was able to control his plane, but Fort went into an irreversible dive and crashed. The accident occurred 10 miles south of Merkel, Texas, in Mulberry Canyon. At the time of the accident, Cornelia Fort was one of the most accomplished pilots of the Women's Air Service. The footstone of her grave is inscribed with "Killed in the service of her country." And god damn it, I want to visit this woman's grave and leave flowers. I never knew about this. I knew about the Pearl Harbor thing. I did not know about her career with the Women's Air Service. So God bless her. Pour one out for the homegirl.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Sometimes truth really do be stranger than fiction.
But anyway. So yeah, that is Cornelia Fort.
I don't know what to say.
So now we get into the rest of this episode is gonna move pretty quickly because we're now at the attack on Pearl Harbor. We see that I love the contrast between the loud roaring Japanese planes cut to the very quiet, peaceful harbor. Loud roaring Japanese planes. Oh, look at these sailors taking a shuttle to Ford Island for church service. Loud roaring Japanese. Like, I love the it's about to happen peak of the stress, the climax of our stress. The events at the beginning of the attack are historically accurate. The attack occurred just as Morning Colors was being played, right before 8 a.m. The ship's bands would go out on deck, raise the colors, play the national anthem. Ford Island would be raising their flag. Some of the smaller vessels would just send a couple guys, like you see the submarine, which I believe is the USS Bowfin, which is a museum ship you can visit. I have stood on the Bowfin. It's very cool. Raising flags, and that was the normal morning routine. And as that routine was happening, the attack started, and there is this like 30 seconds that people aren't 100% aware of what's going on. And I love the two naval officers. Get that guy's tail number, Dick. I'm going to report him for violations. Single bomb drop explosion, and they're just standing there. The last little moment of levity we're going to get, and it's so weird to laugh at, but I love it so goddamn. It's such a MASH moment to me. It has big 5 o'clock Charlie vibes for a second.
Has big Henry Blake vibes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We see that the band finishes playing the national anthem right as the attack starts, and there's a point of contention that I would like to make on behalf of those who can no longer speak for themselves, and also on behalf of Lieutenant Commander Conter. For whatever reason, the story started to circulate after the attack, probably to incite more emotion for the helpless American sailors caught by surprise. There was rumors around and stories that the American sailors were killed while sleeping in their bunks. They had no chance to defend themselves. Lieutenant Commander Contour, I have heard him say, and I will speak on his behalf now, that is utter bullshit. My words, not his. The band dropped their instruments and ran to battle stations. You'll see the movie depicts a lot of the band. The drum major with his his big stick, whatever the hell that is. I don't know. Is that a telescope? Is that just a big fucking telescope? Because it's kind of cool. You'll see him pointing at an anti-aircraft battery, directing fire while holding onto that big fuck off telescope. Like, Lou was adamant the couple times I've heard him talk about this. No sailor was killed in their bunk asleep. If they were killed in their bunk room, it was getting fucking pants on to go up and man a gun, or man a firefighting station, or man a hose. no sailor was killed not at their battle station. And if they were, it certainly wasn't asleep and helpless. That was a big thing that Lou preaches, is that, and I said it earlier in the episode, the sailors were trained, they knew what to do, they were ready to act. And the movie does a good job portraying this, that within seconds of the attack happening, return fire has started. They weren't surprised into no defense. They were surprised in being ready with an active defense. They were ready to respond, but they were not ready to be preemptive. That was the success of the Japanese attack. Right before this, we got Lieutenant Commander Fuchida announcing back to the fleet and carried on back to Yamamoto the name of the movie, the code phrase for complete tactical surprise, Tora, Tora, Tora. Hence the name of the movie. And now
That's why they call it that.
They said the thing. So yeah, we see immediately defense of Pearl Harbor goes into action. And I'm just going to skim through and point out major things, because we're now at the point that all the drama is over. It's action until the end of the movie. The Navy starts firing back. Torpedoes are striking. Airfields are being bombed. One of the saddest scenes to me during the attack is Admiral Kimmel in his whites at his house waiting for his driver, and he's just standing on the driveway in front of his quarters, just looking at Pearl Harbor being bombed. And he's like, oh shit, we were the target. And there's nothing he can do now except mitigate. The airfields being bombed. All these are practical effects, by the way. This was done in the 70s where you had to capture your effect on camera. No visual effects, no computer graphics, nothing. It's all practical.
And see, that's the thing about this movie, is that for practical effects, they spared no expense. You know, there are some movies from this time period where the practical effects had to be a little more cost effective, and they'd go to scale models or something. I'm sure there was a little bit about that in this movie too, but I mean, good God, it's like somebody filmed it on December the 7th. It's remarkably well done. I can't sing that praise enough.
Yeah, I can't say more than that. The Japanese attacked with torpedo bombers, high-level bombers, and dive bombers. The flight of B-17s did arrive in the middle of the attack and did attempt to land safely. Easier said than done, given the circumstances. There was a point of contention I found in my last-minute research today that did the single gear landing, was that planned, or was it a malfunction while filming? From what I understand and from the director's commentary, it was planned. Like, that was a thing they made happen for the film. The choreography of the fight is wonderful. There is again, nice that they did it. This is the one thing. How do I word this? I like that it's mentioned in the movie. I do like that it's given a little bit more screen time in the Michael Bay Pearl Harbor movie, but it's also done very cheesily and very panderingly, so that's not really a compliment. We do get a quick scene of an African-American sailor manning a water-cooled .30 caliber gun and firing back at the Japanese. This is a reference and direct depiction of a sailor named Doris Miller, who at the time the U.S. Navy was segregated, and African-American sailors were relegated to not non-combat, because they would obviously serve on combat ships, but roles such as cooks, not manning gun type roles, right? Or damage control. But he is a sailor, he is doing his duty, and he would win the Navy Cross, but many argued that he should have earned the Medal of Honor. So that's a whole nother rabbit hole you can go down about Doris Miller. In fact, give me a moment here. There's one other fact I'm not remembering, but I know there's something else.
I'm looking into his life a little bit, mostly his death because I didn't realize that he was a casualty in the war. But
Mhm.
he was on a
That's what I remembered. That's why I wanted to look it up.
yeah. Uh,
Yeah, he was transferred to a carrier. He would then what carrier was he? I'm trying to figure out. He was on the Liscum Bay, the USS Liscum Bay, and it was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. He was part of the uh, group of sailors that was determined to be missing, and he was listed as presumed dead. Uh, Ironically enough, his parents were informed that he was missing in action on December 7th, 1943. The Liscum Bay, which is the only ship lost during the Gilbert Islands campaign. Uh, His commendations include the Navy Cross, a posthumous Purple Heart, a Combat Action Ribbon Good Conduct Medal, American Defense Service Medal with Fleet Clasp, American Campaign Medal, Asia Pacific Campaign Medal, and World War II Victory Medal posthumous. What a badass! And
may he rest in peace. My
there
God.
were calls for him that to retroactively have earned the Medal of Honor that I don't think have, unfortunately, have not gone anywhere, if I'm remembering correctly. But yeah.
Wow.
Anyway, so yeah, and it says here, although not identified by name, Miller is portrayed by Elvin Havard in the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. In Michael Bay's 2001 film Pearl Harbor, Miller is portrayed by Cuba Gooding Jr. And Miller being awarded the Navy Cross was depicted in the 2019 film Midway. Which
Wow.
I will say, the 2019 film Midway might be the most recent World War II movie I'd say since Band of Brothers, that I thought was fantastic. I think they did a great job incorporating CGI and visual effects, but still having it have the feel of the late 60s, early 70s war movies. So go check out Midway. Also, go watch the original 1976 Midway, which has edited cuts of the Battle of Pearl Harbor at the beginning of the movie from Tora, 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 I believe.
Oh, that's so cool.
Because it basically Midway, 1976 Midway, I argue is a sequel to Tora, Tora, Tora. But that's a whole nother conversation.
I've got this photo pulled up of Admiral Nimitz himself putting the Navy Cross on Miller. Just what a badass. Anyway,
so in the course of the attack, all the battleships would take multiple torpedo and bomb hits. The Oklahoma would capsize fairly early during the attack. Very famously, so the Japanese were, like with the torpedoes, the Japanese were very intelligent. They took 16-inch naval armor-piercing artillery shells that weighed 1,200 pounds each. They fashioned them into bombs so they could be dropped from directly over the battleships and pierce the weakest armor, which is the deck armor. It was one of these bombs that would pierce the deck of the USS Arizona just aft of the number 2 turret, striking 1 million pounds of cordite black powder.
Christ.
1 million pounds of black powder. Everything forward of the superstructure was incinerated. That is the very famous film you see of the battleship blowing up with the big pillar of black smoke and fire. Of the 2,400 casualties of Pearl Harbor, 1,700 of which would be aboard the Arizona. Half of the casualties of Pearl Harbor were aboard the Arizona.
Oh my God.
And let me confirm, I want to make sure I'm getting that number correct. 1,177 of the 1,512 crewmen on board were killed, approximately half of the live loss during the attack.
Wow.
Yeah. For reference, the turrets on the Arizona were numbered front to back. So the forward turret is 1, the one behind it on the barbette is 2. you have the superstructure, and then turret 3 is the raised turret on the barbette. Turret 4 is the deck level turret aft, right?
Okay, yeah.
When the bomb went off, Quartermaster Third Class Conter at the time was standing just inboard between turret 3 and 4. So he was almost in the exact opposite spot of the ship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
And he was shielded from the blast. But yeah, homeboy, I am looking at the picture of the Arizona exploding, and I'm like, I have met a man who is in that photo. Holy shit. Like, god damn. So we see Admiral Kimmel coming in and getting kind of the sit rep. California torpedo, West Virginia torpedo, Oklahoma capsizing, Arizona exploded. And while they're going over this, a spent bullet comes through the window and strikes Kimmel in the chest. This is a real thing, but it does not have enough force to puncture him or harm him. And he looks at the bullet and says, it would have been more merciful if it had killed me.
I know that I should not make this comparison, but I'm going to anyway. Do you remember a few times when I'd walk up to the rifle range, just say hi, and one day in particular, you say, hey, Ethan, check this out. And you put
I've had this exact thing happen to me. Yep. So while teaching at summer camp, I did have the 1 in a million occurrence of a round perfectly ricocheting back off the sandbags and striking me in the chest. And then it bounced off my chest with enough momentum to hit the kid shooting in the neck. And basically like low power BB gun hit. Like it startled him, but it didn't hurt him. And I called a ceasefire because I'm like, I don't want anyone to panic because they just watched me and this other kid jump and react to what very clearly was an object coming back at the deck. But yeah, I have had this exact thing happen to me. Almost in the exact same spot that you see it depicted.
I would hope that the words out of your mouth following the ceasefire would have been merciful if it had killed me.
No. I was more concerned. The poor little fucking 11-year-old that was sitting there thought he had just been shot, so that was not going to be. He was still in that like first few seconds of, oh my god, he had that moment of what happened. Oh shit, I know what happened. Oh wait, why am I not in pain? Like he had that like sudden reaction of, oh my god, did I just get shot? And he's like, wait, no.
That's a very broad range of emotions to go through that quickly. Yeah, I feel for that kid. Oh my lord.
By the time I asked him if he was okay, I think he realized he was okay, but for a split second I'm like, oh, he is petrified.
Yeah. Well, I can't blame him.
I need to when the Arizona detonated, the 2 highest ranking naval officers killed in the attack at Pearl Harbor were killed. This would be captain of the Arizona, Captain Van Valkenburg, and Battleship Division 1 Admiral, who was using the Arizona as his flagship, Admiral Kidd, Rear Admiral Kidd. The 2 highest ranking officers killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor. They would both be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, I believe. Command of the ship, just for fun, trivial knowledge, command of the ship would fall to Executive Officer Lieutenant Samuel G. Fuqua, who I have heard direct firsthand accounts from Lieutenant Commander Conter of what they did after the battle to deal with the ship, clean up, all that jazz. And Commander Fuqua was very much central in that of getting the ship abandoned safely and getting casualties off. And he was also awarded the Medal of Honor for his cool-headedness while quelling the fires and getting survivors off the battleship. So Commander Fuqua, very cool dude from the stories I have heard.
Very cool.
They finally had to abandon the Arizona when they were still trying to fight fires and they were up to their knees in water because the ship had settled. As we learn in the movie, when the ship settled, it crushed the water mains to Ford Island. So, yeah, not great. Simultaneously, Hickam Field was attacked, Wheeler Field, all the major Army airfields on the island were attacked. and strafed by fighters to prevent a counter force getting in the air. I don't know if we've passed it. We have not passed it yet, but we get to the scene where Washington is starting to realize, oh shit, it's Pearl Harbor. Oh shit, it's Pearl Harbor. Oh shit, it's Pearl Harbor. And I know we just watch a bunch of American sailors die, but one of the most gut-punching scenes in the movie for me is this next scene.
Yeah.
Where Cordell Hull is informed that Pearl Harbor has been attacked. He was informed that Pearl Harbor was attacked at 2:05 p.m. Washington time. Caruso and Nomura would walk into his office to deliver the Japanese 14-point ultimatum at 2:20 p.m.
Oh.
Neither Caruso or Nomura were in the loop about the attack. They had no idea the Japanese fleet was sailing for Pearl Harbor. They had no idea the attack had happened. They had no idea the attack was even being planned, because that's how secretive the Navy was being about it.
Oh.
They walked in there and looked like the biggest horses' asses from Cordell Hull's point of view. And I genuinely feel kind of shitty for Caruso and Nomura in that sense. They were acting in the way they saw was right to achieve as diplomatic of a solution to all this as they could.
Yeah.
And their government just basically used them to stall for time.
Oh,
and
man.
It's fucking frustrating. I feel so, specifically Nomura and Hull, because they had a friendship. But
oh
yeah.
Oh, it's
And those two would leave that office and go out the steps of the State Department with reporters and camera flashes going off, and they're like, what? They had no idea. They're like, what the fuck is happening? They realized something happened, but they're like, what happened?
It has to be an indescribable emotion to find that out. I mean, I don't
Well, you're
even
also
know
on the front line of that Japanese sense of honor. Is they technically were going to deliver the points about a half hour before the attack started.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's argued like, oh, it was just circumstance that it was delivered after the time they planned, but in their eyes, it would be their fault. Like, it would be incredibly dishonorable that they were the point at which that failed.
Mm-hmm.
But enough about that. Let's talk about some planes exploding.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I love this scene.
So, again, practical effects. We're seeing, I believe it's Wheeler Army Airfield being strafed. And during this, all the P-47s that are under motion that are being blown up while they're trying to take off are remote controlled with, dummy pilots in them. Very cool effects. At one point, there's a plane that careens out of control, crashes into a bunch of other parked planes, and nearly runs over about a dozen airmen and ground crew. Awesome scene, incredible effect. They lost control of that plane. Those men were actually running for their goddamn lives, and they kept that cut in the film. And it's fucking awesome.
I feel so bad for the one guy who's front and center.
Just face plants.
And that had to hurt. He does that little bounce up from the force and then just scrambles behind the car. My God.
Skips his head right off the concrete. Yeah, bonk.
Talk about adrenaline. I mean, thank God they're all okay.
Yeah, no one was injured in the filming of that scene that I'm permanently that I'm aware of. But hey, this is why, again, this era of filmmaking is cool, because there's not even the opportunity for that to accidentally happen anymore, because it's not a practical effect anymore, which is kind of a bummer. But
and then the very next scene, the plane exploding as it's trying to take off with the propeller running away from it.
How do you catch that on camera? I didn't call it out last night, but how do you have, just by chance, catch that on camera? I need to watch it again here. Hang on, I'm gonna.
It's such a cool thing to watch. Even
if it was staged to try to make that happen, it's so just perfectly timed.
Yeah, I don't care if that was staged. They got that shot.
God, the clack, 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 clack fall. It's so good. It's so good. But we see that earlier, this dispersal of P-40s to this auxiliary air bases did kind of work. The two pilots that we saw earlier are able to get in the air, and this is true. Some American pilots were able to get in the air and score some damage and hits on Japanese aircraft. I think ultimately the Japanese would lose 29 of the 350 planes in the attack, which, to be fair, incredible loss ratio. Like,
Yeah.
I think they lost 9 in the first wave, 20 in the second wave.
Yeah, as long as we got points up on that scoreboard, especially considering it was a surprise attack like that. And like you said, nobody was asleep in their beds. They were, but still to go from 0 to 100 that quick and take down 29, credit where credit's due, and they deserve a lot of it.
The next scene will justify our entire excuse of this is a MASH podcast and this is a MASH related movie. One of the officers, I believe, on the bridge of the USS Nevada is Major Stoner from the For the Good of the Outfit episode. All right, moving on.
Very cool.
That's our entire justification for this.
That's it.
No, this is a really cool, and I believe I shared the video with you, and I'll put it in our video. The Nevada attempted to get underway and get out of the harbor, and as soon as the Japanese attack force saw that she was underway, she became the target of everyone's aggression. There's a great piece of footage from one of the docks during the attack that you see the Nevadas trying to make it out of the harbor, and you just see little sparkle flashes of all her anti-aircraft batteries going off. It's an incredible bit of footage. But
so what was the ultimate plan? To get out of the harbor and into open water, or
get into open water where you could at least try to maneuver and avoid, and not just be a sitting target for a torpedo. But they got about halfway to the entrance of the harbor, and they realized we are going to sink, and we cannot block them out of the harbor, and they would beach themselves as to not block the harbor. There's actually a memorial for the Nevada where she beached herself. I had the pleasure on the day after the Pearl Harbor ceremonies attending a specific ceremony just for the Nevada and speaking to a Nevada veteran.
Was the Nevada ever put back into service, or was it
I'm glad you asked. So, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a lot of the ships were basically either salvaged, refloated, or written off as destroyed.
Sure.
The Arizona was one of the Arizona, and actually there's a second ship from the attack that is in Pearl Harbor still. The USS Utah, which was being decommissioned into a target ship. But it still had a crew aboard and still suffered casualties. It is a rusting hulk on the other side of Ford Island that has a memorial to it as well, but it's not quite as ornate and well known as the Arizona.
Right.
But because the Arizona lost 4/5 of its crew in an instant, so fair. So the Arizona, after she was stripped of all her stuff. First of all, and this comes from Lieutenant Commander Conter as well, they couldn't get aboard the ship to fight fires until like Thursday. The reason why is because the fire was so intense, they couldn't safely walk on the ship. The metal was still hot 4 days later.
Oh.
Yeah. The ship would be stripped of everything above the waterline for salvage. Her gun turrets that were still functioning were installed as single gun batteries on Hawaii. Some of the gun batteries would be named after ships that were not refloated, such as Battery Pennsylvania. Although Battery Arizona would never actually be completed because the war ended before then.
Oh my gosh. I was looking up photos of the USS Arizona, and it came to my attention that Lou Conter is the
Lou Conter is
last.
the only surviving survivor of the Arizona anymore. He is 102 years old
Wow.
and smarter than you and I. Like, the man is still all there mentally. He is an incredible dude.
Um,
I will give the audience. He finally sat down and had a book written about his time in the Navy. It's available on Amazon. I will share a link to it because absolutely worth the read. But so the guns were recovered from the Arizona and used in batteries. Ironically enough, the first and last time that Battery, Pennsylvania would fire its gun was in a training exercise on Victory in Japan Day in August 1945. Both forward turrets were left in place temporarily, although the guns from Turret 2 were salvaged and later installed as replacement guns on the USS Nevada in the fall of 1944 after being straightened and realigned. The Nevada would later fire these guns in support of shore operations for the invasions of Okinawa and Iwo Jima. So
now that is some poetic justice.
The Arizona got a little bit of revenge.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's awesome. That's so great. Oh.
What else?
Wow.
What else? So yeah, the Nevada tried to make her way out of the harbor, beached herself. The lots of instances where I know Lou, during telling a story, he is selectively choosing what parts to tell and what parts he wants to talk about. But burning fuel oil in the harbor, and at one point he was instructing other sailors to render their shipmates unconscious if they had to keep them from abandoning ship, because they would jump into the burning fuel oil.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do.
Render your shipmate unconscious if you have to keep them from killing themselves unintentionally.
Killing themselves in a spectacularly horrifying fashion, too.
Yep.
I mean, no death is a good death, but some are a hell of a lot worse than others. Oh.
Neat little dogfight sequence between the P-40s and the Zeros, and I'll point this out. I don't actually. Some of them are Zeros, some of them are dive bombers. But earlier in the film, I believe it's Commander Fuchida is talking. Not Fuchida. One of the other air commanders is talking about that the new naval fighter, the Zero, is the best fighter he's ever flown. It can outmaneuver the German Messerschmitts and the British Spitfires. That is true. The Zero at the early onset of the war was probably the best air-to-air combat fighter. It was light. It was very maneuverable. It was very fast, and it had a decent armament of 30 caliber machine guns and 20 millimeter cannon. The problem was it was unarmored. So by the time, once the Americans caught up and were building planes that could fight the Japanese planes were literally flying gas cans.
Oh.
It only took a short, and you can see if you've watched the History Channel for any length of time about the Pacific War, you've seen the gun camera footage from the Pacific of a little burst of fire from the American plane, and the Japanese plane is just ball of fire.
Right. Yeah.
It is. Jokingly, the Americans said it was made of rice paper and fuel, like, and that's sadly accurate. And unfortunately, Japan very quickly depleted its pilot corps because of it. Another, again, tastefully well done scene, I think, is we're at the telegram office. We see that the telegram, the Western Union boy, is running telegrams into the the base here, the base communications office, and he drops off the telegrams alerting of potential enemy attack. And there's this just brief moment of the desk sergeant taking the telegram and doing the double take to this young Japanese American boy in the midst of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and he just kind of has that, Anyway, just I think it's a very tastefully done little, like, hey, this is gonna be a thing. Anyway, Another great practical effect: the Japanese plane getting damaged and uh, doubling back to crash into the American hangar. Great practical effect. Also, great bit of foreshadowing that once Japan becomes desperate enough, dying for one's emperor is the greatest glory a soldier can have, and then we will get into the bonsai attacks of the end of the war. That is not really under the purview of this film. We get Cordell Hull and the ambassadors from Japan, Kurusu and Nomura, who again have no idea what has happened. And I'm gonna quickly look up Cordell Hull's actor because it didn't come up, because he does this scene fantastically well. George McCready, that's his name. You've seen his face all over the damn place.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You recognize him from westerns, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember what some of the westerns he's in are. I don't know. I see. Here's the problem. There were so many freaking westerns made that I don't know which ones are the good ones to point out and which ones aren't.
I'll tell you where I know I recognize him from is the Shawshank Redemption.
That's right. Wait,
but I do believe.
Are you looking at the right person?
Probably not.
His last acting role for me is in 1971.
Okay.
So I don't think he was in.
I think it's a mistake because it credits him in the Shawshank Redemption and doesn't list a character, and that links me to his other.
Yeah, that's got to be a mistake because I'm looking at the list on his Wikipedia and it stops in the same place that IMDb does.
Yeah. Okay, that's weird. No, but The Stranger Wore a Gun is the one I remember him from.
What year was that?
1953.
1953. The Stranger Wore a Gun. Okay. Nice. Yeah, I know I've seen him in a bunch of stuff. I just can't.
Yeah.
I just don't remember him specifically. So yeah, Cordell Hull, played by George McCready, is excellent. So you can tell he is furious, but trying to maintain like some diplomatic composure. And he says that this is the most treacherous act he could ever have conceived any foreign government of doing, essentially. The Japanese flight returns from their attack. The Japanese had 3 waves prepared, but only sent 2 of them. This is a point of contention that, again, could Japan have won the war? No, but it would have absolutely been a much bigger blow to the American Navy had the 3rd wave been launched and they had focused on dry docks and fuel stowage. They focused primarily on naval assets like the actual ships, but the fact that the carriers were not there, the dry docks were intact, and the fuel was intact greatly helped the Americans recover from the attack much, much quicker. As the movie wraps up, we see that telegram finally makes it to General Short, and he is frustrated. It finally makes it to Kimmel, and he reads it out loud, and they're like, well, cool. Anyway, Admiral Halsey makes it back to port, and he does not want to stay there long because he does not want to risk being attacked. Admiral Yamamoto hears the Japanese news announce the successful attack of Pearl Harbor and praises him for planning. And he says the very famous but very much not true line, unfortunately. This was no evidence exists of him actually saying this. But it does not mean he did not believe it's the sentiment. He says he intended to deal a fatal blow to the American fleet, and it was intended that our attack would happen after our government's intentions were delivered to Washington. I have learned that our intentions were not delivered until 55 minutes after the attack. This is the worst possible series of events. I fear all we have done is awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. And that is exactly what he did. Because overnight, America's want to get into a foreign war went from less than 3% of the population to almost 100% of the population. And President Roosevelt would use the undeclared attack as a major point in his request to Congress for declaration of war. The very famous, December 7th,
Yeah.
1941, the date
Wha-
which will live in infamy speech.
Widely
Yes.
regarded as one of the best speeches of all time.
Also, the last formally declared war the U.S. Declared. Don't think about that. And then it ends on this great shot of Yamamoto just standing on the deck of his flagship, contemplating what he does now, because Japan has tipped its hand. They are committed to whatever happens now,
Yeah.
and he knows it's most likely not going to end. And that is the end of Tora. Ethan, what'd you think of this movie?
I don't even know quite how to describe it. I was not expecting such levels of historical accuracy. I was not expecting such a grand scale of not only actors but visual effects. And I was not expecting the story to be so riveting. I mentioned it at the very beginning, but I stand by it. It's not a typical movie structure in, the setup to the plot and then the climax and then the resolution. It's story, intermission, action,
Mm-hmm.
resolution. And it's just done so well. It's more of a I don't even know what to say, a visual novel than a movie. I don't know how to describe my thoughts accurately enough other than just incredible.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite war movies. Like I said, I like a lot of different war movies, even some of the goofier ones like Kelly's Heroes and stuff like that. But this type of war movie, the one that's very historically accurate and is trying to tell the grand picture from all sides, I really like. Um, I neglected to post the reminder that we were doing, like I would for an episode, asking for people's comments. So, listener, if you have comments on Tora, we'll set aside a few minutes in the next MASH episode recording to answer your comments. But tell us, what are your thoughts on both the movie, the historical events? Did you know any of the things we talked about? Did you not know any of them? In closing, I would like to mention why we elected to do this. Again, if you're listening to this on the day it came out, it's Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. Take a moment to do with that what you will. But again, the reason I want to do this is, one, we're very rapidly approaching a time that I cannot comprehend, when we will no longer have direct sources for this, right? Like, for me growing up, I never knew a World War I veteran, right? Like that, I was born after. World War I will always be, to me, written history, not learned in person history, right? World War II is different. I have had the opportunity to talk to several World War II veterans. And the thought that we are soon not going to be able to ask questions directly of the people that were there is uncomfortable. I don't like it. So please, if you have the opportunity to in the next few years, to speak to a veteran, to ask, even not a veteran, even if it was your great grandma who stayed home growing her own turnips for the war effort, whatever. If you know someone from that time period, ask them about the experiences, because we're getting to the point where now we have to trust the records we have as opposed to new information we can glean from the people that lived it. But in addition to that, there's the whole, after the Pearl Harbor attack, there was the rallying cry, "Remember Pearl Harbor." And they and I heard it over and over and over again when I was in Pearl Harbor from the veterans. "Remember Pearl Harbor, keep America alert. Remember Pearl Harbor, keep America alert." As I've gotten older, that's gone from "Remember Pearl Harbor, the people who died, but it has become more remember Pearl Harbor in the sense that, as we've seen from this movie, things don't happen in a confined, isolated box. There are outside factors. There's keep your mind open, pay attention to what's going on around you, both on a small scale and on a large scale. Because if you do, a lot of things make more sense and you can react and better adapt to those situations. That's the big thing Lou's always said, is he doesn't he shares the stories about Pearl Harbor so it's remembered, but he also shares the stories so that we, the younger generations, can glean some insight from what he went through and his shipmates and his fellow servicemen went through. Not necessarily to prepare us for war, but to prepare us for the fact that, A, shit's going to happen, and if you keep your eyes open and your head up and pay attention, you can be ready for it and not let history repeat itself in some form or fashion.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, to all of you out there, we have 119,000 service members left, and on average,
That's
not
like an estimate.
yeah, and not to be too morbid, but an average of 131 die every day, which means, mathematically speaking, we have 2.5 years left to learn from these people that
Mhm.
experienced things that we right now cannot fathom. Uh,
Yeah.
sit down with them.
Before, yeah, absolutely. Before we go, I do want to shout out some, and again, there will be links to this everywhere I can put them. Some of the sources I got for information, um, uh, for this book, I'm sorry, I'm trying to look up the name of Lieutenant Commander Kantu's book. I can't remember the name of it right. Oh, how could I not remember this? It's the Lou Conter Story, from USS Arizona Survivor to Unsung American Hero. That's one of the reference books I used to get some of his statements and thoughts on parts of Pearl Harbor. I would also highly recommend reading it, just because something I didn't mention about Lou. If you have a loved one who served as a pilot in the Air Force, or you served as a pilot in the Air Force, and they went through the SEER training, survive, evade, resist, and escape, yeah, Lou developed that. Lou was a Black Cat Catalina pilot after his time on the Arizona, and his experiences getting shot down in the Pacific made him realize, hey, we should probably teach our pilots how to, survive and resist capture and resist attempts by the enemy to torture them into revealing information and to keep their morale up. And so he developed SERE, SERE, and that would go on to later save the life of one Senator John McCain. So read the book about Lou Conter. He is one of those people that the more you learn about him, you're like, you're a goddamn like comic book. You're like a Captain America comic book person. What the hell?
Are you familiar with the 7 degrees of separation theory, that everybody in the world is
Yes.
connected by 7 degrees or less? I just found mine.
Hmm.
It's nuts. Uh,
Hmm.
eh,
There was a brief moment in my time working with doing events where Lou was also attending. There was a brief moment in time where I would have possibly gotten to meet face to face Senator John McCain, which is like, huh? like there was not a 0% chance that that might have happened. But that's a whole nother series of stories.
oh
But
yeah.
but and again, I don't say that to brag. I say that because just the weird, again, much like the lead up to Pearl Harbor, just the random shit that happens in people's lives is
Hmm.
ridiculous. But yeah, the Lou Conter Story, uh, look it up, buy it, read it. It's a great book. Lou, there was a time a few years ago where me and a bunch of the other people that knew Lou did not think he would sit down and do a book with an author. Read it. The fact that this man, I specifically thanked him and said, I know you didn't want to do this initially. Thank you for doing it, because God, the stories that you have in your head that you just throw out randomly, that I've heard people say, oh yeah, Lou told this story I've never heard before today. Just incredible. So that book, go read it. If you would also like to, I'm gonna handle this one with kid gloves. One of my Eagle Scouts many years ago, when we were doing stuff more actively with Lou, when he was out and about more, made as his Eagle Scout project, made a documentary about Lou. You can watch it on YouTube. He and his dad did not believe me when I said they should spend the 12 hours to upload it in 1080p. They wanted to upload it quicker, so it is a very low quality video, but it is made with lots of love, and it is written and produced by the Eagle Scout. I helped edit it because I had a computer powerful enough to do it, and he did not. It's interviews with Lou, interviews with veterans at the Pearl Harbor ceremony back in 2016. And the historical context is read very, very PBS low budget documentary style by other Eagle Scouts. It's great. But there's some great clips of Lou telling his stories in that. It is called Witness to Infamy. It is on YouTube if you look for it. I would also like to shout out the YouTube channel History Buffs. He does watches of historical movies and kind of goes through the filmmaking process and the historical event that it's portraying, and breaks down where it is and isn't historically accurate. I'm happy to say that Pearl Harbor, the movie, is incredibly historically accurate, like immensely so.
Hell yeah.
So there will be a link to his video on that. That is a train. Okay. Also, huge shout out to one of the series that really made me excited to do this episode. Extra History on YouTube. They do little animated, like 3 to 5 episode series on historical events, and where they add more context to something you might already know. I specifically used their Path to Pearl Harbor series, which is where I got a lot of the information about the kind of back and forth leading up over the decades. Their Japanese militarism series, and their End of the Samurai series, to kind of build off each other, to kind of get the historical context we talk about. Again, I will link all of that in the description. I hope if you had not watched Tora before this, you had a chance to, or are going to after this. If you do, thank you, because I think you should. It is a wonderful film. And I hope that you learned something you maybe didn't know about Pearl Harbor, because again, I find it fascinating. Not just Pearl Harbor, yes, but in history and greater. If you start dissecting history, the constant domino falling effect of how history works, like things that a Roman emperor decided on a whim 1,500 years ago are directly affecting shit we do today, and it, like, all that shit boggles my mind. And Pearl Harbor is just a little microcosm of that. So, Ethan, I have been talking almost nonstop for a long time. Is there anything else you have to say?
No, I don't think I could say anything better than you have. Just watch this movie. Watch it twice. It's worth it.
Finally, I would like to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon supporters. As I've said before, you guys, we did this as a fun side project because you guys provide a little bit of money each month to help us make the podcast break even, so we can afford to post an extra, what I hope isn't going to be another 4-hour episode of a podcast, to the hosting site, and not have it affect us too much in the wallet. So huge thank you to you guys. That's as always, Sergeant Timothy Burleson, Lieutenant Mike Jameson, and Private Jared Gallagher. Go check out the Patreon if that is something you might be interested in supporting us further with. If not, no big deal. We will be back and with our regularly scheduled MASH programming on our regular 2-week schedule after this. This was just a fun little extra thing. We hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And as always, remember Pearl Harbor, keep America alert.